God. Hello, I'm Rachel, and if you somehow saw me go in and out of live for the last hour, no, you didn't. Also, I had technical difficulties. Did I already say my name? Oh my god. Hi, I'm Rachel. This is my book club. This is a weird angle. And it's a vampire book club. That's the theme. And it is currently untitled. And we are reading the Mammoth book of vampire stories by women, edited by Stephen Jones. Yeah. Oh my god. I'm still a little, like, off kilter because, oh my god, you don't know how many times I, like, started and restarted. I thought it was just like I had to restart my computer or something, but no, it was, oh my god. Anyway, we read vampire stories here and we talk about them, and it's fun. And that's my pitch. We are not very far in this book. Let me see. I'm terrible at putting a bookmark in this thing. I just plop it down when I'm done and pick it back up a week later, and then I have to flip to where we are. Story 9. Yeah, out of 34? 35? So, not very far. A lot more to cover. Yeah, there it is. First story is Just His Type by Storm Constantine. The book includes a blurb about the authors before the story. They're like semi-audio biographical, except they it also was published in like 2000 or something, so it's 2001. So it's not exactly up to date, but let's see. I like that they have quotes by all the authors. It's really cool. You get the a little paragraph of insight into their work. When I was researching my novel, Stalking Tender Prey, recalls the author, which was primarily about the legends of fallen angels, it seemed clear to me that the vampire myths might also have stemmed from the same origins. The biblical rendition of the fallen angels derived from earlier myths from Sumeria, which perhaps came from times earlier than that. The story seemed tantalizingly to suggest that the image of winged beings grew from memories of a real race of flesh and blood who were vulture shamans. The idea of them having wings could derive from the fact that in their rituals they wore the wings of griffin vultures around their shoulders. Ancient remains of these wings have been found in caves in the Middle East, along with bones and other evidence of ritual. Drinking the blood of both animals and humans is something the fallen angels were accused of doing, and this may well have been part of their shamanic rites. It wasn't really appropriate to include this aspect of the myth in Stalking Tender Prey, so I was glad to be given the opportunity to explore it in the story for this anthology. I like the title, Stalking Tender Prey. That immediately piques my interest. But it's about fallen angels, which are not so much the thing that I go for, but whatever. Oh my god, I'm so off kilter. Did I even say the title? Just His Type by Storm Constantine. Okay. The trouble was that she was just his type. Sitting at the back of the stuffy pub function room, her eyes fixed upon him, she commanded his attention, apparently without effort. He could tell she was tall because her head was the highest on the row. Her hands were clasped in her lap, and she was dressed in black. She had come to watch the famous historical investigator and author Noah Johnson deliver a lecture. He found he was playing to her alone throughout the evening. He knew the talk, vampires in myth and history, off by heart, having delivered it countless times before. He updated it constantly, but essentially it was the same old stuff. colorful but careful. He was selective about what he gave the punters. He knew how to please a mixed crowd. The regular meetings, enigmas of history, were going well. He ran it once a fortnight in the upstairs room of his local pub, the Gun and Duck, and now had a regular attendance of around 50 people. Sometimes he had to turn some away. More than 50 in the front row started fainting. He'd started it to augment his writing income for the periods when funds were slack, a downside of any writer's life, but it was going so well he had planned more events, outdoors, now that summer was coming. Sarah would have loved all this, but he mustn't talk about her now. She was no longer part of his life. I'm intrigued that this random lecturer could just talk to 50 people all of the time, and like people are always showing up, whatever. Noah's friend and assistant Gary dimmed the lights in preparation for the slideshow. Some of the audience were fanning themselves with the handouts Gary's girlfriend Abby had placed on every seat prior to the meeting. The windows were open, but did little to improve the air quality in the room. One by one, the slides slipped across the screen, illustrations copied from ancient texts, photographs Noah had taken himself while investigating in far corners of obscure Eastern European countries. Some of them had been reproduced in Noah's best-selling book, The Search for Nosferatu. The subject no longer captivated him. He'd done it and it was over, but the public were always hungry for it. Noah had moved on to other things and was currently researching his next book, which was concerned with the mythical landscape of the remote Scottish islands and how the strange ancient structures there might have come to be built. Okay. When the lights came back on, Noah's eyes were drawn immediately to the girl on the back row. He half expected to see that she'd left. That would be just his luck, but no. There she was, sitting straight and demure, gazing at him from beneath downcast lashes, a slight smile on her lips. He began to answer questions from the audience, but was anxious to keep it short tonight. If people wanted to air their opinions, which most of them did, especially the regulars, they could continue in the back downstairs. He interrupted a woman as she was speaking. "Hey, it's too hot up here. Shall we move down?" Most of them would go home, but the ones who saw themselves as the core of his group would remain until closing time. It was only 9 o'clock. People started getting out of their seats, apparently as eager as he was to escape the hot function room. The woman who'd been interrupted looked crestfallen, somewhat confused. Gary and Abby began clearing up, gathering the dropped leaflets, packing away the slide equipment. "Good turnout," Gary said. "You could hire a bigger place," Abby suggested. "You'd still pack it." Noah was looking at the crowd shuffling out. He saw that the girl in black had remained in her seat. He smiled at her and she stood up. He went towards her. "Excuse me, Mr. Johnson, would you mind if I asked you something?" "Of course not," he said. "Come down to the bar. We usually stay on for a few drinks." "Thank you." He put his arm behind her proprietorily to guide her to the door. "Thanks, Noah," Abby called behind him. "We'll just finish off, shall we?" He grinned back at her, and she shook her head in mock disapproval. Abby was used to him, and he knew how much she could get away with. Sounds like a dick. Okay. Downstairs, punters insisted on buying Noah drinks, but he bought one for the girl himself. "I haven't seen you here before," he said, leaning on the bar. She pulled a face. Her features were delicate, mobile. "No, I've only just moved here. It was great to discover this group, especially that it's run by you. I've got all your books." He laughed. "Thanks." In his mind, he could hear Abby's warning cry of, "Noah, she's a fan, okay? For God's sakes, be careful." The girl brushed strands of dark hair from her eyes. Her well-shaped lips were painted perfectly in the dark purple. Her dress was of black lace and velvet down to the floor. She was virtually the same height he was. "I'm Laura, by the way. Laura Hoskins." Noah handed her a vodka and tonic. When she took it from him, he saw that her lace cuffs came right down to her fingertips. The nails were painted black. Is any of us surprised that there's a goth in this story? "So what did you want to ask me?" He was conscious of the eyes of his core group upon him, their resentment at a newcomer monopolizing him. Normally, this was the time for Noah to hold court. "Well, I have to admit, it was the subject of the talk tonight that most attracted me," Laura said. She laughed nervously. "Not that I wouldn't have come anyway, of course." "And? Why don't you talk about the origins of the vampire myth?" "I do. You heard it. She was silent for a moment. I think we both know there's more to it than that. Essentially, it's European, although there are parallels in Mesopotamian and Judaic mythology. But where do those myths come from? There are recurrent themes in every mythology. People the world over have the same fears, the same desires. There's no reason to think the vampire myth comes from a single root source. Now I'm kind of concerned as I'm reading this. Maybe I should give them, like, they sound like the same person. Or should I give them an accent? God. But in Nosferatu, you implied differently. What are you getting at? Noah asked, grinning. Don't tell me you're a vampire searching for your roots. A vampire would certainly... Oh, I missed a whole sentence. Oh my God. Good Lord. Okay. She was silent for a moment. I think we both know there's more to it than that. Essentially, it's European, although there are parallels in Mesopotamian and Judaic mythology. But where do those myths come from? There are recurrent themes in every mythology. People the world over have the same fears, the same desires. There's no reason to think the vampire myth comes from a single root source. But in Nosferatu, you implied differently. What are you getting at? Noah said, grinning. Don't tell me you're a vampire searching for your roots. A vampire would certainly not color up the way she did then. I have a serious interest in the subject, she said. I'd hoped you'd take me seriously, too. Look, he said, if you want the truth, I think people can become obsessed with certain myths, especially the vampire ones. It's dangerous. How? She looked hungry. Any obsession is dangerous. I don't like to encourage it. He was thinking of Sarah. Her face was before his eyes, and sad and despairing. What happened? Laura asked in a low voice. It was as if she knew already. He could tell her easily. She could be his confessor. I knew someone, he began. Then a hand slapped his back. Hey, it was Abby. Don't tell me you haven't got drinks in for us, she smiled at Laura. He treats us like lackeys. Sorry, Noah said. He turned to attract the attention of the barman. For the rest of the evening, Abby refused to leave Noah's side. He knew why. Abby knew him too well. She was good company and gave no indication to Laura that she was suspicious of her, but Noah was well aware of his friend's feelings. After last orders, when the group was breaking up, Noah said to Laura, there's an event next Sunday. We're going on a tour. I just noticed that I'm nice and big, but you don't need to. I like making me nice and small, so it's more of a moody atmosphere thing. Woo! Breaking up my own story to talk about myself. Good. Oh, God, where was I? After last orders, when the group was breaking up, Noah said to Laura, there's an event next Sunday. We're going on a tour of local ancient sites, churches, springs, and so on. Should be quite a convoy. Would you like to come? Well, Laura put her empty glass down on the bar. Might be difficult. I don't have transport. I could pick you up, said Noah. Great! Laura opened her bag and rummaged in it. I'll give you my address. What time? Oh, about Monday. It'll cost a tenner, said Abby, somewhat darkly. Good value, Laura said, taking the lid off a fountain pen. Outside in the car park, Abby started on Noah. What are you up to? She demanded. I thought you decided to leave punters well alone. What do you mean? Noah countered, fiddling with his keys. I mean that you fancy her. It's obvious. But you've been down this road many times before. You know where it leads. She's just coming to the event, Noah said. What's wrong with that? Lots of other people are going, and they're all punters as well. Abby folded her arms belligerently across her chest. I'm not stupid. Give him a break, will you? Gary snapped. Abby was not to be deterred. She's a fan, Gary, and she's got her sights set. There's something a bit odd about her. I can just feel it. He's a grown man, Gary said in a tired voice. For Christ's sake, Ab, you sound like his bloody mother. I'm the nearest he has to that, Abby said, getting into the front passenger seat of Noah's car. For the next few days, Noah couldn't stop thinking about Laura Hoskins. Abby was wrong to be so suspicious. Of course, he had met Sarah at a lecture long before he'd begun the regular meetings, and perhaps this was why Abby was so scared for him. He dated lots of girls since, some of them plucked from the Enigmas of History group, and he was the first to admit that none of them had worked out particularly well, but he was sure this was different. Laura was bright and had an inquiring mind. There were no warning signs. Her hands had been steady on her glass all evening. She'd been open and sociable. All right. Okay. It's just, this guy just sounds like a dick. By Sunday morning, he was buzzing with anticipation and spent more time than usual on his appearance. Laura was probably about 10 years younger than him, in her mid-20s by the look of her, but that didn't matter. He looked young for his age. All his life, women had flocked to him. When he drew up outside her house, she came through the front door before he'd even turned off the engine. She was dressed in black jeans and t-shirt, with a black hooded fleece tied around her waist, presumably in case it got cold later. Her long black hair was caught up in a severe ponytail, but swished provocatively around her head and shoulders as she ran down the short drive to the road. She was as slim as a boy and looked athletic. Noah's heart turned over. She was gorgeous. "Hi," she said breathlessly as she virtually threw herself into the car. She smelled strongly of an oriental yet floral scent. "Hi," Noah echoed. "I like a woman who's ready on time." Laura laughed. It was a bright, free sound, devoid of artifice. Of course, she'd been ready for hours. When they'd arrived at the meeting place, Noah was pleased to see there was a good turnout, about 7 packed cars. Abby was going round collecting money and distributing maps. At each site they visited, Noah had the group sit down and meditate to see if they could pick up any information from the past, such as what the site might have been used for in ancient times. He never did this at the indoor meetings. This was his select group, with whom he was prepared to try more, quote-unquote, weird stuff, as some refer to it. During the meditation, Laura saw a great deal of detailed and pertinent imagery. "I think you're psychic," Noah told her privately. "Oh, I know that," she said. "You couldn't be more perfect," Noah said. Laura smiled. When can we continue our conversation?" "Later. How about dinner?" "Sounds great." Ugh. Noah had to lose Abby and Gary for the evening, which was not easy. He didn't want Abby to know he was taking Laura out, sure that she would insist that he and Gary went with him. Fortunately, they'd brought their own car that day, so at the last site, Noah whisked Laura off quickly, virtually without saying goodbye to anybody. He knew he'd have to pay for it later and could anticipate Abby's terse message that would be waiting on his answer phone when he got home. But for the time being, he didn't give a darn. Both he and Laura were giggling as his car skidded away in a cloud of dust and gravel. "Why do I get the feeling we're playing truant?" Laura asked. "Sometimes I want a bit of privacy, that's all," Noah answered. The trouble with these events is that people want to carry it to carry on till all hours. Sometimes that's fine, but tonight," he glanced at her, and she smiled. He took her to a Thai restaurant he'd never visited before, secure in the knowledge that none of the group would track him there. The food was rather lackluster, but it didn't matter, because Laura was sitting opposite him, and her smile seemed to enfold him in a hazy golden mist. They were both high on the sense of being secret conspirators. They were high on the potential of what might happen later. Laura seemed content to listen to Noah talk about his new book, and it wasn't until the coffee arrived that she broached the subject she'd brought up after the meeting last Tuesday. "Why did you react so badly to my question?" "I don't think I did. Some things I just steer clear of." "So what's the story behind it?" She took a sip of coffee, smiled disarmingly. "Or is it a secret?" Noah leaned back in his chair. "It's no secret. If you become part of the core group, and I'm sure you will, anyone would tell you about it. Basically, I was writing the Nosferatu I was involved in. While I was writing Nosferatu, I was involved in more than the obvious method of research. The problem came from that." Laura put her head to one side. "What do you mean?" "You saw what we did today. People are keen on the psychic stuff. On one level, it's harmless, and most people never go beyond that, but on another, it isn't. Sitting outside an old church and trying to visualize images of the past can't hurt anyone because it's dead and gone. It's nothing more than a psychic photograph, but other things, well, they're more alive, still around, so to speak. Laura laughed, lit a cigarette. Are you trying to tell me that you contacted a vampire psychically? Noah hesitated for a moment. Part of him didn't want to say more, but Laura's wide eyes were fixed on him with a bright, intelligent gaze. He felt safe with her. Oh my God. I worked with a girl called Sarah. People don't realize it, but a lot of the information in my books comes from what I call inspired sources, from psychics. Most of what I find out can't be used in a serious book because it can't be checked out and verified as fact, but it gives me a feel for and understanding of the subject. Sarah was my assistant and also my partner. She was very psychic. Was, Laura said, her chin resting in her hands. Smoke curled around her in slow trembles. That sounds ominous. Let's just say that I was interested in the origin of the vampire myth, like you are. I'd investigated all the legends of blood-drinking demons from medieval Europe right back to Sumerian times. Somewhere along the way, the flavor of the subject changed. He gestured with both hands. It's difficult to describe, but the idea of the vampire as unfortunate undead, perhaps a victim of their circumstances, mutated into the idea that the original vampires were very much alive and that their vampirism was by choice, a necessary facet of their belief system. Laura nodded enthusiastically. That's my thought also. It all seemed very academic to us. We called them the Vulture People, a shamanic tribe who indulged in blood drinking and sacrifice. Sarah picked up some interesting stuff that pointed us in the direction of certain ancient sites in Turkey. The imagery she saw could be verified. These places existed, and there was archaeological evidence that a shamanic culture existed there who had worshipped vultures. They believed that drinking blood gave them superhuman abilities. Whether that was true or not, we thought that other tribes would probably have regarded them as supernatural, as demons even, because of their bloodthirsty habits. We believed that there was a diaspora and that factions of this tribe might have moved gradually into Europe. No, I always say that wrong. Yes. Oh my God, I'm sorry. Oh my God. Okay. And the factions of this tribe might have moved gradually into Europe, eventually giving rise to the vampire legend. I mean, I'm just, not to cut this up, but like, I would also be very weirded out by people who worshipped vultures. Have you seen a vulture? One, they're scary as hell, and two, they're gross as hell. So, all right. Every evening, I'd have Sarah go into a kind of trance, guiding her further and further back into the past, seeking the true story. It seemed we were meant to discover all this, to make the link. The Vulture People became more real for us, powerful shamans who used the rites of blood to change their world. As time went on, Sarah started to get jumpy about it. She said she sensed little dark things that scuttled in the folds of these creatures' vulture wing robes, that they had begun to touch her. She wanted to stop, but I persuaded her otherwise. I thought we were getting close to something that would prove my theory incontrovertibly. We had to continue, but then one night Sarah brought something back with her. Yeah, this guy's a dick. There was a silence while Laura took a long meditative draw on her cigarette. Then she said, and Sarah couldn't cope. Can you hear my cat? Oh my God. Noah pressed the fingers of one hand briefly against his eyes. He could hear her screams even now. It was too overwhelming, too alien. We always did these sessions by the light of one candle so we couldn't see much, but it was as if the night just surged into the room. We were surrounded by a presence, not evil exactly, but beyond good and evil. It was amoral, and we were nothing to it. Even I could sense it, and I'm no great psychic. In moments, I realized how we'd been playing with something inconceivably huge and beyond us, something immeasurably powerful. We pulled at its skirts too insistently, and now it had noticed us. What happened? Well, once Sarah started screaming, I just leaped up and put the lights on If something really had been there, it disappeared. He finished off the warm lager left in his glass and shook his head. Sarah was writing on the floor. Oh, I think that's supposed to be writhing. Sarah was writhing on the floor. I didn't know what to do. The noises were hideous. In the end, I slapped her. It's what you're supposed to do, isn't it? And she kind of came out of it, but even if things had gone, it left a taint behind. Did it kill her? Laura asked bluntly. She's kind of a dick too, isn't she? Noah detected a faint note of scorn in her voice. Oh yeah, she's a dick. No, of course not. Sarah was an experienced psychic, but she was damaged by what she'd felt and seen. It changed her, and there was nothing I could do about it. Nothing. She became paranoid, jealous, and afraid. It destroyed us. It wasn't your fault, Laura said, reaching out to touch one of Noah's hands. He laughed cynically. They all said that, but it's not true. I was so eager to discover the truth. I didn't think about the dangers. I just kept pushing and pushing. After we split up, Sarah lost her job. She just lost it, big time. The last I heard, she'd admitted herself to hospital. She dropped all her old friends. It wasn't your fault, Laura insisted. Sarah just wasn't strong enough. She was, Noah said. It was stronger than both of us. I don't believe that. You weren't there. Even as a writer, I don't have the words to describe to you how terrible that night was, how real the entity that came to us. It wasn't Christopher Lee in a silk cape, Laura. This wasn't a nice, safe meditation like all those we did today. This was the most raw and primeval energy. It could snuff you out like that. He snapped his fingers before her face, but she did not flinch. I can't snap anymore. I want it, she said. He laughed shakily. What? It's what I want. I need to know the truth. I'm not afraid. Noah raised his hands and shook his head emphatically. No, you don't know what you're asking for. The vampires you're so enamored of, they're just fashion accessories, a romantic myth. You don't want the truth of it, believe me. How dare you, Laura snapped. You make me sound like some stupid little girl who's just into looking weird. I'm not enamored by anything. She thumped her chest with a closed fist. I've lived with this stuff all my life, felt it tugging at the corners of my mind, trying to make itself known to me. Their carry-on smell has always been strong to my senses. When I read Nosferatu, I thought I'd found someone who would understand, who wouldn't think I was mad. She put her hands against her head, scraped them through her sleek, confined hair, pulling strands of it free. If you really are so against it, why did you put all those coy clues in the book? Noah thought she now looked demented, with her hair beginning to fall over her face, a hectic flush along her cheekbones and those wild, wide eyes. But she was breathtakingly beautiful, and in those moments he could believe she was as strong as she claimed to be. You'd better tell me what you mean by saying you've lived with it, he said. Laura ducked her head in assent and then summoned a waiter to order more drinks. No, Noah said. I'm driving. Let's get the bill. We can talk at my place. This is like all dialogue, huh? And the author is very aware of it all being all dialogue because they just kind of keep talking, but they just go, oh no, we've been in this one spot too long talking. Let's go somewhere else and talk. All right. They were silent in the car on the drive home. Laura sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring through the windscreen. Noah wondered what he was doing. He guessed what would come. In was as... Why does it say in? It's it. It was inexorable as a tidal wave, and he could clearly see it was massing on the horizon. He could stop it now, take her home. They passed the turnoff that would lead to her road. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. In 10 minutes, he was parking the car outside his house. Inside, Laura wandered around the living room, touching lightly the ancient artifacts that clustered on every available surface. Sarah had collected most of them, but hadn't wanted to take them with her when she left. She hadn't taken anything, or exercised her rights to have half of the house. She just wanted out, to cast off any vestige of her life with Noah, desperate to live in the here and now in safe mundanity. But it was denied her. No one else should go to the place where Sarah was. No one. Oh, God, not to interrupt again. Kitty. Come here. Come here. You can't just stand stand there and cry at me. It's not fair. Come here. If you want something, come here. Come here. Say hello to the camera. Give her the views she deserves. Can I read the book with you? No, because you're going to run away the moment I put my arm down. Okay. Noah made coffee in the vast, silent kitchen, where modern appliances gleamed on the spotless work surfaces. Sarah had the kitchen installed, paid for it herself. The cutlery and crockery Noah had used for his lunch still lay in the sink, but generally he kept the house tidy, out of respect for her, as if she were still around, in an etheric kind of way, and might disapprove of clutter and mess. On the way back to the living room, he took a bottle of brandy and 2 huge globe glasses out of his liquor cupboard and placed them on the tray next to the cafetiere, French press, and mugs. Laura was curled up in the big leather armchair by the hearth and had lit. Oh my God, I'm getting all distracted. You're adorable. Laura was curled up in the big leather armchair by the hearth and had lit the log effect gas fire. She had also managed to find the tiny ashtray that Noah kept reluctantly for guests. "You're so lucky," she said as Noah came into the room. "This place is great. Tons of books and things. How many bedrooms has it got?" 5, Noah answered. "I'm in the wrong job," Laura said, laughing. She seemed just like an ordinary girl now, gamine and flirtatious. Noah set down the tray on the coffee table and set about pouring drinks. "We got this place for a song," he said, rather apologetically. "It was a dump. Sarah did it up." He looked around the room. "It's worth a bit now, of course, but all I'd need is a couple of bad years and I'd have to sell it. Writing is not the millionaire's game it's made out to be, you know." "I'm surprised to hear you say that," Laura said. "Most people are. They think we all live like Jackie Collins." "No, I meant that you know how to change fate, how to make things happen. Why don't you use it for yourself so that you don't get any of those bad years?" "You've lost me," Noah said, pushing a glass of brandy and a coffee across the table towards her. "I'm a writer, a researcher, not a bloody magician." Laura smiled, turning in her fingers a lock of hair that hung beside her face. "Oh, come on. What about the weird stuff? If I knew how to meditate money into existence, I'd be rich. But I don't. I just use the weird stuff to delve into the past." "But the vulture people knew how to change their world. You said so." "Strangely enough, I have no compelling desire to drink blood and murder people." He was enjoying their exchange, sure that the undercurrent was sexual. Was I supposed to be reading this more flirtatiously? "Strangely enough, I have no compelling desire to drink blood and murder people." Was that flirtatious? Oh my God. Laura picked up the brandy globe. "You've contacted them," she said. "How many people have done that? If you weren't scared shitless, you could use that energy for yourself." Slowly, sensuously, she drained her glass. Noah knelt back on his heels, his hands braced against his thighs. "I think you are a dangerous young woman," he said. "You wouldn't have to kill anybody," she said, holding out her glass for more brandy. "I'm sure the smallest of blood sacrifices would do." Noah poured out a generous measure of the golden liquor. "I'm not going back there, Laura. I got burned, and sensibly pay attention to what hurts. You don't put your hand in the fire twice." "When people have no fear, they can walk across red-hot coals," Laura said. "I'm scared of madmen with knives and perverts hiding in alleys. I'm scared of people because they're shit. But etheric entities don't frighten me. They don't have hands of flesh and blood. They can't fire a gun. The only way they can hurt you is through fear, your own mind. You must know that." Noah hesitated. He could feel the conviction pulsing from Laura's body. "You are a witch," he said, and took a long drink of his brandy. It burned his throat. Felt good. Her eyes were hooded now. "Take me there, Noah. I'm not afraid to go alone, and I won't freak you out by having the screaming heebie-jeebies." Just take me there." "Why?" he said. "Because they want you to," she said. "I've heard their voices whispering in my dreams since I was a child. I've seen their shadows in the curtains of my bedroom every night. I've felt their carry-on breath on my face in the dark. I'm one of them, Noah. Not in this life, perhaps, but know them. I want to go home." "Okay, crazy lady." The silence in the room was absolute, and the atmosphere had become still and watchful, like vulture shamans. It was as if Laura had already conjured something into being through the passion of her words. There was no way he could disbelieve her. She looked remarkably sane, but driven. He could not speak. "I'm not some sick cow who wants to drink blood," Laura said in a conversational tone. "I don't have a black bedroom or collect horror films. I don't want to be a vampire in the traditional sense. I just need to know what it is that has been trying to get through to me, that's all." She smiled. "God, I must sound mad. What else do I have to say to convince you I'm not?" He stared at her, wrestling with himself, thinking of Sarah. "I'm a bloody good psychic," she said, mischievously, cocking her head to the side. "You can always use one of those, can't you?" "Then why do you need me? If you're that good, do it yourself." "You have the map," she said. "You are the guide. It's that simple." She adopted a mock-serious tone. "I'll look after you, Noah. Don't worry. You'll be perfectly safe." His meditation room was at the back of the house on the second floor, overlooking fields in a small wood. As he'd always done with Sarah, he kept the curtains open and lit a single candle. His heart was beating fast, but not through fear. He was not sure exactly what he felt. As he prepared to light some loose incense to help conjure the right atmosphere, Laura said, "Have you got a pin?" "What?" "To prick our fingers. We should put our blood into the incense." "Laura." "Noah!" She was laughing at him. It took some minutes to find a pin, by which time Laura had consumed another globe of brandy. Noah himself was beginning to feel the effects of the alcohol. Perhaps it was numbing his sense of apprehension. He let Laura prick his thumb and squeeze a bright droplet of blood from the wound, which she shook into the incense. As she put his thumb into her warm mouth and sucked it, "Scared?" she said. "Horrified." She pricked her own thumb, but didn't offer to let him taste her blood. It was a slight disappointment. Laura lay down on the rug before the cold earth, while Noah sat cross-legged beside her and took her gently into a light trance. The words were sporific. His own eyelids began to droop. He led her back through time, made her watch the centuries fall away, until he told her to visualize herself standing at the mouth of a cave amid high, wind-sculpted crags. Beyond the threshold, all was dark. "This is the Shanadir Cave," he murmured, "home of the vulture people. Walk into it." He paused, listening to her light breathing. "Tell me what you see." "Darkness," she replied. Her brow had creased into a frown. "But I can smell," she would say blood, he thought. "Flowers," she said faintly. "Everywhere, flowers. They've placed them over the bones. I see them. So many bones. There are wings. Is anyone there with you?" "Yes." Her voice was like that of a child, young and tremulous. "Do you want to leave?" Noah said. "You can leave at any time." "No. He knows me. He wants to give me something." "What?" "The talking bone." "What does he look like?" Suddenly, Laura gasped. Her eyes flew open, and she sat bolt upright. Noah reached out to steady her. It's okay," he said. She turned her head slowly, and when she spoke, her voice was deep and rasping. "Keep me not from her, son of Lamech." Her laughter filled the mountains and bowed the heads of the wild beasts. "Shame took her from me. Shame." Noah could smell carrion, the reek of her breath. Abruptly, Laura sighed and fell back gracefully on to the floor. "Laura," Noah breathed, leaning over her. "Laura, are you all right?" She laughed and wriggled her body on the rug. "Oh, yes." Without opening her eyes, she reached up for him, dragged him down. When he kissed her, he tasted brandy, the flame of it. "Thank you," she murmured between kisses. "Thank you." Her skin was hot beneath his hand, exuding the last warmth of her perfume. He made love to her while she lay, wondering if she was fully in this world or not. It didn't matter. She was a dream come to life, a woman who could walk alone into the dark and come back, laughing and smelling of flowers. I think it does matter. Consensually. Whatever. Afterwards, she lay naked beside him, smoking a cigarette. What the hell was there to be scared of, she said. Have I brought anything back with me? No, and believe me, I willed it. Noah lay on his side, stroking her taut belly. What did he look like? She grimaced. Pretty much how you'd think. At first, he was crouched down, wrapped in this immense cloak of black feathers. It looked like it had been made from the whole wings of a single vulture. I could just see the slits of his eyes peering over the top. He looked like a vulture himself, like a vampire. Although he was crouched down, I could tell he was a giant, magnificent, wise, and savage. That's pretty powerful imagery, Noah said. Then he stood up and opened his cloak of wings. Beneath it, he was dressed in animal skins. His body was covered in some kind of paint, but it wasn't blood. There were patterns in it, like primitive cave paintings. He did have bones in his hair and wore a necklace of bones. Bird bones, I think. You'll be pleased to know he had pointy teeth. All of them. Filed down? Probably. She took a fierce draw of her cigarette. Oh, I don't know. Maybe I saw what I wanted to see, or was influenced by what you said earlier. What about what he said through you? I don't know. It was as if he'd known me before, obviously. He seemed to know you too, in a way. Lamech was the father of Noah in biblical myth, wasn't he? Noah nodded, uncomfortable with the idea that the entity might be aware of him. If the whole thing wasn't subjective, Laura said, maybe I lived in his time once. Maybe we were lovers. I certainly felt really horny when I came out of it. He doesn't sound very attractive. Laura stubbed out her cigarette and reached for Noah's crotch. Oh, but he was. Beautiful, in fact. His eyes were amazing, this deep, piercing blue. Christ, I wanted him to possess me. Utterly. It was the archetypal thing. She laughed huskily. I'd have been quite happy for him to sink his teeth into me. Noah leaned over and nipped the skin of her throat. Come on, let's go to bed. It's getting cold in here. They made love several more times. Noah felt euphoric, hardly daring to believe a woman such as this could come into his life. She was full of humor and warmth, serious about her ability, yet amusingly irreverent. She was uninhibited, open, mysterious, and fey, a witch woman, a priestess. Where have you been all my life? Noah said. I bet you say that to all the girls, she replied, and they giggled like children at the stupid cliches for several minutes. About 4 o'clock, Laura said she was tired and turned on to her side of the bed. Noah studied her for some time, drinking in each detail of her smooth contours, the spill of dark hair upon the pillow. He paused his hand in the air above her body, and she squirmed and made a sound of pleasure as if she felt him stroking her aura. Beauty, he whispered. Love. He lay down to sleep, closing his eyes with the after-image of her white flesh burning in his mind. Waking came with a shock in the gray of pre-dawn twilight. He was aware at once of cold, saw that the bed beside him was empty. A terrified pang of loss coursed through him. Then he saw her clothes still draped on the pale wicker chair by the window and told himself she had gone to the bathroom, or else to get herself a drink. He lay on his back and pulled the duvet over his chilled torso. A hiss in the corner of the room made him start. Laura! He sat up. Most of the room was still in shadow, but he thought he could make out a dark shape hunched in the corner near his clothes rail. Laura. He reached to turn on the bedside lamp, but the switch did not respond. The bulb must have gone. Again a hiss, low and sibilant. Something moved in the shadows, sidled forward. He saw the eyes clearly first, a deep, piercing blue. She was naked and had covered herself in what looked like dark paint, which was possible because there were a few tins left in the garage. Her hair was wild and straw-like, filled with sticky substance. Her tongue protruded unnaturally from her mouth like that of the destroyer goddess Kali. Her teeth could not possibly be pointed. There were no tools in his house she could have used to do that. She hissed and stamped with one foot. Laura. He got out of bed slowly. This was so different to the time before with Sarah. Laura wasn't screaming. She wasn't raving or weeping. Her eyes followed him as he skirted the room. He held out his hands in the universal gesture of peace. Laura, wake up. You're dreaming. It's not real. Laura. She made a threatening lunge towards him, growled, and stamped both feet. He jumped back. It was unreal. He couldn't feel anything because it was so unreal. The night had come into the room, not darkness, but the essence of night, the absence of light, the cold of the earth before the first dawn rose. Laura! She came for him then, scuttling with crab-like speed across the room. She grabbed him by the shoulders, and he felt the sharp prick of her fingernails. She stank of rotten meat, and there was a crust around her lips. She was bleeding from the mouth. Her teeth were filed away to ragged points. What pain she must be in. What pain. He fought back. This wasn't Laura. This was the darkness he had hidden from for so long. Perhaps it had always been here, lurking in the shadows of his house and his memories. She was so strong, like a tigress. She pushed him back onto the bed and straddled him. Her breasts looked heavier than they had been earlier, scored with the marks of her own fingernails. She uttered a shriek and lunged for his neck. He should be afraid, shouldn't he? This thing, this monstrous abomination dredged from the primal soup, was feasting on him, tearing at his flesh, kneading his skin with its claws, sucking the life from him. It stank of hell. Yet he was aroused by it. He wanted her, and she let him do it, her body bucking in frenzy. Gross. Then he saw it, and he saw it then, the tunnel into history, the rivers of blood that carried the memories of humanity. It is within all of us, he thought. We have tamed it and dressed it up in a silk suit. We have made it dead. We have contained it in books and films and lascivious dreams. We have contained it in nightmares. But ultimately, it is within us all the time, and it is alive, pulsing, warm and wet, stinking of musk and spoiled meat. Laura wasn't stronger than Sarah. The opposite was true, because Sarah had rejected this. It was what she had seen and felt and had never spoken of. The search for Nosferatu didn't begin in the grave, but in the reptile brain, the primordial remnant of beast within every human mind. It was demonic. It was divine. In the late morning, with bright sunshine coming into the kitchen, they were politely formal with each other. She said she had badly chipped a tooth falling over in the dark. They didn't talk about how she decorated her body. The mess in the kitchen had been cleaned up by the time he had come downstairs, and she was freshly showered, smelling of his patchouli body wash. She joked about her loathing of dentists as she carefully drank her hot coffee. He made toast, then apologized and offered something softer. Scrambled eggs, perhaps? She wasn't hungry, she said. He rubbed his neck. Well. She had to go to work at 2. Worked part-time in a local shop. Perhaps she could get an emergency dental appointment before she went in. He had work to do, too. The book would be late to his publishers otherwise. Nice day, though. Yes, nice day. At the door, she pecked his cheek in a brief kiss. We must do this again, she said. Must we? Many words hung unspoken between them. She smiled. She looked very tired, and there were purple rings beneath her eyes. I think I got what I wanted. Didn't you? Laura, you can call me. Or not, she said. I don't need you now, Noah, but I kind of like you. He watched her run down the path to the road. She had rejected a lift. He leaned his forehead on the door frame. Once your eyes are open, you can never close them again. Sarah knew this. He shouldn't see Laura again. He should attempt to forget all that had occurred. They'd been drunk. She'd broken one tooth, that's all. It had been less than he'd imagined. As if to remind him otherwise, his neck twinged painfully. He felt lightheaded, sick, suddenly able to imagine the future, the long, slow, agonizing stretch of it, the descent into realms he dared not think about. He shouldn't see her again, but she was just his type, wasn't she? Just his type. Okay, 2 douchebags who have a really weird affair. Why are you still into her, you weirdo? That was fun to read. I mean, it sounded like, at least up to this was written, that Storm Constantine, the author, that was just his type by Storm Constantine, hasn't written any other vampire books. Egyptian feline goddesses and esoteric psychology. Science fiction, horror, and fantasy. And then she said stalking tender prey is about fallen angels. I don't know. I enjoyed it. Once again, I want more of their work. The omnibus of subtle advertising is working on me. I don't know if I'll look her up more than that, though. I don't know. It was creepy and weird, and I enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it. We can explore these authors together. Next story is Prince of Flowers by Elizabeth Hand, but before, I'm going to drink a little bit, because that was a long one. My cat abandoned me. Oh yeah, you don't need to see me. Doo-doo. I'm in the corner. Hello. Okay, Prince of Flowers and the blurb. This was my first published story, reveals the author, brought by Toppin King for the Twilight Zone magazine in 1987. What? The Twilight Zone magazine? Wait. What else is in there? It appeared early in 1988. In a phone conversation, Tappan said that I would be a good writer for the 1990s because my work had heart and also sharp little teeth. At the time, I was living in Washington, D.C. and working at the Smithsonian Institution. The demonic puppet of the title was something I bought on my lunch hour one afternoon, walking from the mall to a dim little shop called the Artifactory. I fell in love with the puppet and paid $50 for it, a huge chunk of my meager paycheck. But when I brought it back to my cubicle at the National Air and Space Museum, I announced that it would bring me luck. It did. Shortly thereafter, I wrote the story, and even though it took a year or so, I finally sold it. Yo, I want to work at the National Air and Space Museum. I don't know what I would do, but that would be cool. Okay. Helen's first assignment on the inventory project was to the Department of Worms. For 2 weeks, she paced the narrow alleys between immense tiers of glass cabinets, opening endless drawers of freeze-dried invertebrates and tagging each with an acquisition number. Occasionally, she glimpsed other figures, drab as herself in government-issue smocks, gray shadows stalking through the murky corridors. They waved at her, but seldom spoke, except to ask directions. Everyone got lost in the museum. Helen loved the hours lost in wandering the labyrinth of storage rooms, research labs, chilly vaults crammed with effigies of Yanomamo Indians and stuffed jaguars. Soon she could identify each department by its smell, acrid dust from the feathered pelts in ornithology, the cloying reek of fenugreek, and syrup in mammalogy's roach traps, fish in formaldehyde in ichthyology. Her favorite was paleontology, an annex where the air smelled damp and clean, as though beneath the marble floors trickled hidden water, undiscovered caves, mammoth bones to match the stored above. When her 2 weeks in worms ended, she was sent to paleo, where she delighted in the skeletons strewn atop cabinets like why am I messing up so much? It was all the fancy words. Where she delighted in the skeletons strewn atop cabinets like forgotten toys, disembodied skulls glaring from behind wastebaskets and bookshelves. She found a Fabrosaurus ischium wrapped in brown paper and labeled in crayon. Beside it, a huge hand-sewn crate dated 1886 and marked Wyoming Megasaur. It had never been opened. Some mornings she sat with a small mound of fossils before her, fitting the pieces together with the aid of a Victorian monograph. How do I get this job? What? Hours passed in total silence, weeks when she saw only 3 or 4 people, curators slouching in and out of their research cubicles. This sounds like heaven. On Fridays, when she dropped off her inventory sheets, they smiled, occasionally even remembered her name, but mostly she was left alone, sorting cartons of bone and shale, prying apart frail skeletons of extinct fish as though they were stacks of newsprint. Once, almost without thinking, she slipped a fossil fish into the pocket of her smock. The fossil was the length of her hand, as perfectly formed as a fresh beech leaf. All day, she fingered it, tracing the imprint of bone and scale. In the bathroom later, she wrapped it in paper towels and hid it in her purse to bring home. After that, she started taking things. At a downtown hobby shop, she bought little brass and lucite stands to display them in her apartment. No one else ever saw them. She simply liked to look at them alone. Her next transfer was to mineralogy, where she counted misshapen meteorites and uncut gems. Gems bored her, although she took a chunk of petrified wood and a handful of unpolished amethysts and put them in her bathrobe. A month later, she was permanently assigned to anthropology. The anthropology department was in the most remote corner of the museum. Its proximity to the boiler room made it warmer than the natural sciences wing, the air redolent of spice woods and exotic unguents used to polish arrowheads and axe shafts. The ceiling reared so high overhead that the rickety lamp swayed slightly in draughts that Helen longed to feel. The constant, subtle motion of the lamp sent flickering waves of light across the floor. Raised arms of Balinese statues seemed to undulate, and points of light winked behind the empty eye-holes of feathered masks. Everywhere loomed shelves stacked with smooth ivory and gaudily beaded bracelets and neck rings. Helen crouched in the corners, loading her arms with bangles until her wrists ached, Jesus, from their weight. She unearthed dusty, lurid figures of temple demons and cleaned them, polished hollow cheeks and lapis eyes before stapling a number to each figure. A corner piled with tippy poles hid an abandoned desk that she claimed and decorated with mummy photographs and a ceramic coffee mug. In the top drawer, she stored her cassette tapes, and beneath her handbag, a number of obsidian arrowheads. While it was never officially designated as her desk, she was annoyed one morning to find a young man tilted backward in the chair, shuffling through her tapes. "Hello," he greeted her cheerfully. Helen winced and nodded coolly. "These your tapes? I'll borrow this one someday. Haven't got the album yet. Leo Bryant." "Helen," she replied bluntly. "I think there's an empty desk down by the slit gongs." "Thanks. I just started. You're a curator?" Helen shook her head, rearranging the cassettes on the desk. "No, inventory project." Pointedly, she moved his knapsack to the floor. "Me too. Maybe we can work together sometime." She glanced at his earnest face and smiled. "I like to work alone, thanks." He looked hurt, and she added, "Nothing personal. I just like it that way. I'm sure we'll run into each other. Nice to meet you, Leo." She grabbed a stack of inventory sheets and walked away down the corridor. They met for coffee one morning. After a few weeks, they met almost every morning, sometimes even for lunch outside on the mall. During the day, Leo wandered over from his cubicle in ethnology to pass on departmental gossip. Sometimes they had a drink after work, but never often enough to invite gossip themselves. Helen was happy with this arrangement. The curators delighted to have such a worker, quiet, without ambition, punctual. Everyone except Leo left her to herself. That sounds, again, man, I want that job. Maybe I'll add my little light clip again so that I can read a little bit better. Doop doop. Doop doop. I love this thing. I haven't had one of these since I was a child, but I got it on a whim one day. And it has just made my life a little bit better. It's great. Okay. Late one afternoon, Helen turned at the wrong corner and found herself in a small cul-de-sac between stacks of crates that cut off light and air. She yawned, breathing the faint must of cinnamon bark as she traced her path on the crumbled inventory map. This narrow alley was unmarked. The adjoining corridors contained Malaysian artifacts, batik tools, long teak boxes of gongs, fallen crates, clumsily hewn cartons overflowing with straw were scattered on the floor. Splintered panels snagged her sleeves as she edged her way down the aisle. A sweet musk hung about these cartons, the languorous essence of unknown blossoms. At the end of the cul-de-sac, an entire row of crates had toppled, as though the weight of time had finally pitched them to the floor. Helen squatted and chose a box at random, a broad, flat package like a portfolio. She pried the lid off to find a stack of leather cutouts, curling with age like dissected cloth. She drew one carefully from the pile, frowning as its edges disintegrated at her touch. A shadow puppet, so fantastically elaborate that she couldn't tell if it was male or female. It scarcely looked human. Light glimmered through the grotesque latticework as Helen jerked it back and forth, its pale shadow dancing across the wall. Then the puppet split and crumbled into brittle curlicues that formed strange hieroglyphics on the black marble floor. Swearing softly, Helen replaced the lid, then jammed the box back into the shadows. Her fingers brushed another crate of smooth, polished mahogany. It had a comfortable heft as she pulled it into her lap. Each corner of the narrow lid was fixed with a large, square-headed nail. Helen yanked those out and set each upright in a row. As she opened the box, dried flowers, seeds, and wood shavings cascaded into her lap. She inhaled, closing her eyes, and imagined blue water and firelight, sweet-smelling seeds exploding in the embers. She sneezed and opened her eyes to a cloud of dust wafting from the crate-like smoke. Very carefully, she worked her fingers into the fragrant excelsior, kneading the petals gently until she grasped something brittle and solid. She drew this out in a flurry of dead flowers. It was a puppet, not a toy, but a gorgeously costumed figure, spindly arms clattering with glass and bone circlets, batik robes heavy with embroidery and beadwork. Long whittled pegs formed its torso and arms, and the rods that swiveled it back and forth, so that its robes rippled tremulously, like a swallowtail's wings. Held at arm's length, it gazed scornfully down at Helen, its face glinted with gilt paint. Sinuous vines twisted around each jointed arm. Flowers glowed within the rich threads of its robe, orchids blossoming in the folds of indigo cloth. Loveliest of all was its face, the curve of cheeks and chin so gracefully arched it might have been cast in gold rather than coaxed from wood. Helen brushed it with a finger. The glossy white paint gleamed as though still wet. She touched the carmine bow that formed its mouth, traced the jet-black lashes stippled across its brow like a regiment of ants. The smooth wood felt warm to her touch as she stroked it with her fingertips. A courtesan might have perfected its sphinx smile, but in the tide of petals Helen discovered a slip of paper covered with spidery characters. Beneath the straggling script, another hand had shaped clumsy block letters spelling out the name, Prince of Flowers. Once, perhaps, an imperial concubine had entertained herself with its fey posturing, and so passed the wet silences of a long green season. For the rest of the afternoon, it was Helen's toy. She posed it and sent its robes dancing in the twilit room, the frail arms and tiny wrists twitching in a marionette's waltz. Behind her, a voice called, "Helen?" "Leo," she murmured. "Look what I've found." He hunched beside her to peer at the figure. "Beautiful. Is that what you're on now? Balinese artifacts?" She shrugged. "Is that what it is? I didn't know." She glanced down the dark rows of cabinets and sighed. "I probably shouldn't be here. It's just so hot." She stretched and yawned as Leo slid the puppet from her hands. This is like really lovely writing, but like it doesn't go the way I expect a sentence to, so I just stumble a lot. Oh, I think my problem is I need to like consistently read a little slower. I like the writing. What can I say? Like, I didn't dislike the other writing. This is just more my style, my preferred type. God, where was I? "Can I see it?" He twisted it until its head spun and the stiff arms flittered. Wild, like one of those dancers in The King and I. He played with it absently, hypnotized by the swirling robes. When he stopped, the puppet jerked abruptly upright, its blank eyes staring at Helen. Be careful, she warned, kneading her smock between her thumbs. It's got to be 100 years old. She held out her hands, and Leo returned it, bemused. It's wild, whatever it is. He stood and stretched. I'm going to get a soda. Want to come? I better get back to what I was working on. I'm supposed to finish the Burmese section this week. Casually, she set the puppet in its box, brushed the dried flowers from her lap, and stood. Sure you don't want a soda or something? Leo hedged plaintively, snapping his ID badge against his chest. You said you were hot. No thanks, Helen smiled wanly. I'll take a rain check. Tomorrow. Peeved, Leo muttered and stalked off. When his silhouette faded away, she turned and quickly pulled the box into a dim corner. There she emptied her handbag and arranged the puppet at its bottom, wrapping Kleenex about its arms and face. Hairbrush, wallet, lipstick, all thrown back into her purse, hiding the puppet beneath their clutter. She repacked the crate with its sad array of blossoms, hammering the lid back with her shoe. Then she scrabbled in the corner on her knees until she located a space between stacks of cartons. With a resounding crack, the empty box struck the wall, and Helen grinned as she kicked more boxes to fill the gap. Years from now, another inventory technician would discover it and wonder, as she had countless times, what had once been inside the empty carton. When she crowded into the elevator that afternoon, the leather handle of her purse stuck to her palm like wet rope. She shifted the bag casually as more people stepped on at each floor, heart pounding as she called goodbye to the curator for Indo-Asian Studies pausing in the lobby. Imaginary prison gates loomed and crumbled behind Helen as she strode through the columned doors and into the summer street. All her way home, she smiled triumphantly, clutching her handbag to her chest. As she fumbled at the front door for her keys, a fresh burst of scent rose from the recesses of her purse. Inside, another scent overpowered this faint perfume, the thick reek of creosote, right? Rotting fruit, unwashed clothes, musty and hot and dark as the museum's dreariest basement. The only two windows faced onto the street. Traffic ground past, piping bluish exhaust through the screens. A grimy mirror reflected shabby chairs, an end table with lopsided lamp, furniture flitched from college dormitories or reclaimed from the corner dumpster. No paintings graced the pocked walls, blotched with the crushed remains of roaches and silverfish. But beautiful things shone here. God, that sounds gross as hell. But beautiful things shone here, gleaming from windowsills and cracked formica counters. The limp frond of a fossil firm, etched in obsidian glossy as wet tar. A whirled nautilus, like a tiny whirlpool impaled upon a brass stand. In the center of a splintered coffee table was the imprint of a foot-long dragonfly's wing, embedded in limestone, its filigreed scales a shattered prism. Corners heaped with lemur skulls and slabs of petrified wood, the exquisite coned shells of poisonous mollusks, wounds of green and golden iridescent beetles. Why did I say wounds? Mounds of green and golden iridescent beetles like the coinage of a distant country, patches of linoleum scattered with shark's teeth and arrowheads, a tiny skull anchoring a handful of emerald plumes that waved in the breeze like a sea fan. She has a frickin' skull? Oh my god, girl. Helen surveyed it all critically, noting with mild surprise a luminous pink geode. She'd forgotten that one. Then she set to work. This girl's crazy. Oh my god. In a few minutes, she'd removed everything from her bag and rolled the geode under her chair. She unwrapped the puppet on the table, peeling tissue from its brittle arms and finally twisting the long strand of white paper from its head until she stood ankle-deep in a drift of tissue. The puppet's supporting rod slid neatly into the mouth of an empty beer bottle, and she arranged it so that the glass was hidden by its robes, and the imperious face tilted upward, staring at the bug-flecked ceiling. Oh my god. Helen squinted appraisingly, rearranged the feathers about the puppet, shoring them up with the carapaces of scarab beetles. Carapaces? What? Still, it looked all wrong. Beside the small, proud figure, the fossils were muddy remains, the nautilus a bit of sea wrack. A breeze shifted the puppet's robes, knocking the scarabs to the floor, and before she knew it, Helen had crushed them. The little emerald shells splintering to gray dust beneath her heel. She sighed in exasperation. All her pretty things suddenly looked so mean. She moved the puppet to the windowsill, to another table, finally into her bedroom. No corner of the flat could hold it without seeming even grimier than before. Helen swiped at cobwebs above the doorway before setting the puppet on her bedstand and collapsing with a sigh onto her mattress. Well, maybe if you, dusted sometimes, it wouldn't be that gross and weird. Jesus Christ, girl. In the half-light of the windowless bedroom, the figure was not so resplendent. Disappointed, Helen straightened its robes yet again. As she tugged the cloth into place, 2 violet petals, each the size of her pinky nail, slipped between her fingers. She rolled the tiny blossoms between her palms, surprised at how damp and fresh they felt, how they breathed the scent of ozone or seawater. Thoughtfully, she rubbed the violets until only a gritty pellet remained between her fingers. Flowers, she thought, and recalled the name on the paper she'd found. The haughty figure wanted flowers. Grabbing her key and a rusty pair of scissors. She doesn't even have a good pair of scissors. Good Lord. As a crafter, I am offended. She ran outside. 30 minutes later, she returned, laden with blossoms, torn branches of crepe myrtle, frothing pink and white, drooping tongues of honeysuckle, overblown white roses snipped from a neighbor's yard, chicory fading like a handful of blue stars. She dropped them all at the foot of the bed and then searched the kitchen until she found a dusty wine carafe and some empty jars. Once these were rinsed and filled with water, she made a number of unruly bouquets, then placed them all around the puppet so that its pale head nodded amid a cloud of white and mauve and frail green. Helen slumped back on the bed, grinning with approval. You psychopath. She stole all these things and all the flowers, especially from a neighbor's yard. God. Helen slumped back on the bed, grinning with approval. Bottles trapped the wavering pools of light and cast shimmering reflections across the walls. The crepe myrtle sent the palest mauve cloud on to the ceiling, blurring the jungle shadows of the honeysuckle. Helen's head blurred as well. She yawned, drowsy from the thick scents of roses, cloying honeysuckle, all the languor of summer nodding in an afternoon. She fell quickly asleep, lulled by the breeze in the stolen garden and the dozy blur of a lost bumblebee. Poor bumblebee. I forget that, other people don't get migraines when they smell flowers. Once her sleep broke, a breath of motion against her shoulder, mosquito, spider, centipede, then a tiny lancing pain, the touch of invisible legs or wings, and it was gone. Helen grimaced, scratched, staggered up and into the bathroom. Her bleary reflection showed a swollen bite on her shoulder. It tingled, and a drop of blood purled at her touch. She put on a nightshirt, checked her bed for spiders, then tumbled back to sleep. Much later, she woke to a sound, once, twice, like the resonant plank of a stone tossed into a well. Then a slow, melancholy note. Another well, a larger stone striking its dark surface. Helen moaned, turning on to her side. Fainter echoes joined these first sounds. Plangent tones, sweet as rain in the mouth. Her ears rang with this steady pulse until suddenly she clenched her hands and stiffened, concentrating on the noise. From wall to ceiling to floor, the thrumming echo bounced, grew louder, diminished, droned to a whisper. It did not stop. Helen sat up, bracing herself against the wall, the last shards of sleep fallen from her. Her hand slipped, and very slowly she drew it towards her face. It was wet. Between her fingers glistened a web of water, looping like silver twine down her wrist until it was lost in the blue-veined valley of her elbow. Helen shook her head in disbelief and stared up at the ceiling. From one end of the room to the other stretched a filament of water, like a hairline fracture. As she watched, the filament snapped, and a single warm drop splashed her temple. Helen swore and slid to the edge of the mattress, then stopped. At first she thought the vases had fallen to the floor, strewing flowers everywhere. But the bottles remained on the bedstand, their blossoms casting ragged silhouettes in the dark. More flowers were scattered about the bottles, violets, crimson roses, a trundle rampant with tiny fluted petals. Flowers cascaded to the floor, nestled amid folds of dirty clothes. Helen plucked an orchid from the linoleum, blinking in amazement. Like a wavering pink flame, it glowed, the feathery pistils staining her fingertips bright yellow. Absently, Helen brushed the pollen to her thigh, scraping her leg with a hangnail. That small pain jarred her awake. She dropped the orchid. For the first time, it didn't feel like a dream. The room was hot, humid as though moist towels pressed against her face. As she stared at her thigh, the bright fingerprint, yellow as a crocus, melted and dissolved as sweat broke on her skin. She stepped forward, the orchid bursting beneath her heel like a ripe grape. The sickly smell rose from the broken flower. Each breath she took was heavy, as with rain, and she choked. The rims of her nostrils were wet. She sneezed, inhaling warm water. Water streamed down her cheeks, and she drew her hand slowly upward to brush the water from her eyes. She could move it no further than her lap. She looked down, silently mouthing bewilderment as she shook her head. Another hand grasped her wrist, a hand delicate and limp as a cut iris wand, so small that she scarcely felt its touch upon her pulse. Inside her skull, the blood-throbbed counterpart to the gamelan gongs echoing the throb and beat of her heart. The little hand disappeared. Helen staggered backward onto the bed, frantically scrambling for the light switch. In the darkness, something crept across the rippling bed sheets. When she screamed, her mouth was stuffed with roses, orchids, the corner of her pillowcase. Tiny hands pinched her nostrils shut and forced more flowers between her lips, until she lay still, gagging on aromatic petals. From the rumpled bedclothes reared a shadow, child-size, grinning. Livid shoots of green and yellow encircled its spindly arms, and the sheets whispered like rain as it crawled towards her. Like a great mantis, it dragged itself forward on its long arms, the rough cloth of its robe catching between her knees, its white teeth glittering. She clawed through the sheets, trying to dash it against the wall, but she could not move. Flowers spilled from her mouth when she tried to scream, soft fingers of orchids sliding down her throat as she flailed at the bedclothes. And the clanging of the gongs did not cease. Not when the tiny hands pattered over her breasts, not when the tiny mouth hissed in her ear. Needle teeth pierced her shoulder as a long tongue unfurled and lapped there, flicking blood onto the blossoms wreathed around her neck. Only when the slender shadow withdrew and the terrible, terrible dreams began did the gamelans grow silent. That's fucking creepy. What the hell? I was not expecting, flowers to be a part of the story so far. I mean, a prince of flowers, sure, but whatever. 9:30 came, long after Helen usually met Leo in the cafeteria. He waited, drinking an entire pot of coffee before he gave up and wandered downstairs, piqued that she hadn't shown up for breakfast. We barely know this guy, but he's annoying already. In the same narrow hallway behind the Malaysian artifacts, he discovered her, crouched over a pair of tapered wooden crates. For a long moment, he watched her and almost turned back without saying anything. Her hair was dirty, twisted into a sloppy bun, and the hunch of her shoulders hinted at exhaustion. But before he could leave, she turned to face him, clutching the boxes to her chest. "Rough night?" croaked Leo. A scarf tied around her neck didn't hide the bruises there. Her mouth was swollen, her eyes soft and shadowed with sleeplessness. He knew she must see people, men, boyfriends, but she had never mentioned anyone, never spoke of weekend trips or vacations. Suddenly he felt betrayed and spun away to leave. "Leo," murmured Helen, absently stroking the crate. "I can't talk right now. I got in so late. I'm kind of busy." "I guess so." He laughed uncertainly, but stopped before turning the corner to see her pry open the lid of the box, head bent so that he could not tell what it was she found inside. A week passed. Leo refused to call her. He timed his forays to the cafeteria to avoid meeting her there. He left work late so he wouldn't see her in the elevator. What a big baby. Oh my god. Every day he expected to see her at his desk, find a telephone message scrawled on his memo pad, but she never appeared. Another week went by. Leo ran into the curator for Indo-Asian Studies by the elevator. Have you seen Ellen this week? Helen, why do I want to say whatever? Have you seen Helen this week? She asked, and Leo actually blushed at mention of her name. No, he mumbled. Not for a while, really. Guess she's sick. The curator shrugged and stepped onto the elevator. Leo rode all the way down to the basement and roamed the corridors for an hour, dropping by the anthropology office. No Helen. No messages from her at the desk. He wandered back down the hall, pausing in the corridor where he had last seen her. A row of boxes had collapsed, and he kicked at the cartons, idly knelt and read the names on the packing crates as if they held a clue to Helen's sudden change. Labels in Sanskrit, Vietnamese, Chinese, English, crumbling beside baggage labels and exotic postage stamps and scrawled descriptions of contents. Wei Yang, he read. Oh gosh. Wei Yang Golek, he read. Beneath was scribbled puppets. He squatted on the floor, staring at the bank of crates, then half-heartedly started to read each label. Maybe she'd find him there. Perhaps she'd been sick, had a doctor's appointment. She might be late again. A long box rattled and he shifted it. Chris read the label, and he peeked inside to find an ornate sword. A heavier box bore the legend, Songhyun Spirit Puppet, and another that seemed to be empty, embellished with the flowing scripts, Sekur Mas, and the clumsy translation, Prince of Flowers. He slammed the last box against the wall and heard the dull creaking of splittering wood. She would not be in today. She hadn't been in for 2 weeks. That night he called her. Hello? Helen's voice. At least a man hadn't answered. Oh my God, he's such a baby. Helen, how you doing? It's Leo. Leo, she coughed, and he heard someone in the background. It's you. Right, he said dryly, then waited for an apology, her embarrassed laugh, another cough that would be followed by an invented catalog of hay fever, colds, flu, but she said nothing. He listened carefully and realized it wasn't a voice he had heard in the background, but a constant stir of sound, like a fan or running water. Helen? You okay? A long pause. Sure, I'm okay. Her voice faded, and he heard a high piping note. You got a bird, Helen? What? He shifted the phone to his other ear, shoving it closer to his head so he could hear better. A bird. There's this funny voice. It sounds like you got a bird or something. No, replied Helen slowly. I don't have a bird. There's nothing wrong with my phone. He could hear her moving around her apartment, the background noises rising and falling, but never silent. Leo, I can't talk now. I'll see you tomorrow, okay? Tomorrow, he exploded. I haven't seen you in 2 weeks. She coughed and said, Well, I'm sorry. I've been busy. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye. He started to argue, but the phone was already dead. She didn't come in the next day. At 3 o'clock, he went to the anthropology department and asked the secretary if Helen had been in that morning. No, she answered, shaking her head. And they've got her down as AWOL. She hasn't been in all week. She hesitated before whispering, Leo, she hasn't looked very good lately. You think maybe... Her voice died and she shrugged, who knows, and turned to answer the phone. He left work early, walking his bicycle up the garage ramp and wheeling it to the right towards Helen's neighborhood. He was fuming, but a sliver of fear had worked its way through his anger. He had almost gone to her supervisor, almost phoned Helen first. Instead, he pedaled quickly down Pennsylvania Avenue, skirting a few lanes of rush-hour traffic. Union Station loomed a few blocks ahead. He recalled an article in yesterday's Post. Vandals had destroyed the rose garden in front of the station. He detoured through the bus lane that circled the building and skimmed around the desecrated garden, shaking his head and staring back in dismay. All the roses gone. Someone had lopped each bloom from its stem. In spots, the cobblestones were littered with mounds of blossoms, brown with decay. Here and there, dead flowers still dangled from hacked stems. Swearing in disgust, Leo made a final loop, nearly skidding into a bus as he looked back at the plundered garden. Then he headed towards Helen's apartment building a few blocks north. Her windows were dark. Even from the street, the curtains looked filthy, as though dirt and exhaust had matted them to the glass. Leo stood on the curb and stared at the blank eyes of each apartment window, gaping at the stark concrete facade. Who would want to live here, he thought, ashamed. He should have come sooner. Shame froze into apprehension and the faintest icy sheath of fear. Hurriedly, he locked his bike to the parking meter and approached her window, standing on tiptoe to peer inside. Nothing. The discolored curtains hid the rooms from him like clouds of ivory smoke. He tapped once, tentatively, then, emboldened by silence, rapped for several minutes, squinting to see any movement inside. Still nothing. Leo swore out loud and shoved his hands into his pockets, wondering lamely what to do. Call the police? Next of kin? He winced at the thought, as if she couldn't do that herself. Helen had always made it clear that she enjoyed being on her own, but the broken glass beneath his sneakers, wind-blown newspapers tugging at the bottom steps, the whole unkempt neighborhood denied that. Why here, he thought angrily, and then he was taking the steps 2 at a time, kicking bottles and burger wrappers out of his path. He waited by the door for 5 minutes before a teenage boy ran out. Leo barely caught the door before it slammed behind him. Inside, a fluorescent light hung askew from the ceiling, buzzing like a wasp. Helen's was the first door to the right. Circulars from convenience stores drifted on the floor, and on the far wall was a bank of mailboxes. One was ajar, stuffed with unclaimed bills and magazines. More envelopes piled on the steps. Each bore Helen's name. It's only been 2 weeks. It can't be that much mail. How many credit cards does this woman have? His knocking went unanswered, but he thought he heard someone moving inside. Helen, he called softly. It's Leo. You okay? He knocked harder, called her name, finally pounded with both fists. Still nothing. He should leave. He should call the police. Better still, forget ever coming here. But he was here. Now. The police would question him no matter what. The curator for Indo-Asian Studies would look at him askance. Leo bit his lip and tested the doorknob. Locked. But the wood gave way slightly as he leaned against it. He rattled the knob and braced himself to kick the door in. He didn't have to. In his hand, the knob twisted, and the door swung inward so abruptly that he fell inside. The door banged shut behind him. He glanced around the room, looking for her, but all he saw was gray light, the gaudy shadows cast by gritty curtains. Then he breathed in, gagging, and pulled his sleeve to his mouth until he gasped through the cotton. He backed toward the door, slipping on something dank like piles of wet clothing. He glanced at his feet and grunted in disgust. Roses. They were everywhere. Heaps of rotting flowers, broken branches, leaves stripped from bushes, an entire small ficus tree tossed into the corner. Why is that funny? Just grabbed a whole tree from someone's yard and dragged it home. He forgot Helen, turned to grab the doorknob, and tripped on an uprooted azalea. He fell, clawing at the wall to balance himself. His palms splayed against the plaster and slid as though the surface was still wet. Then, staring upward, he saw that it was wet. Water streamed from the ceiling, flowing down the wall to soak his shirt cuffs. Leo moaned. His knees buckled as he sank, arms flailing, into the mass of decaying blossoms. Their stench suffocated him. His eyes watered as he retched and tried to stagger back to his feet. That's me around flowers. Then he heard something, like a bell or a telephone, then another faint sound, like an animal scratching overhead. Carefully, he twisted to stare upward, trying not to betray himself by moving too fast. Anybody else want to look at the ceiling? Something skittered across the ceiling, and Leo's stomach turned easily. Was there anything weird on my ceiling? No, okay. What could be up there? A second blur dashed to join the first. Golden eyes stared down at him, unblinking. Geckos, he thought frantically. She had pet geckos. She has pet geckos. Jesus. She couldn't be here. It was too hot. The stench horrible. Putrid water, decaying plants, water everywhere. His trousers were soaked from where he had fallen. His knees ached from kneeling in a trout of water pooling against the wall. The floor had warped, and more flowers protruded from cracks between the linoleum, brown fronds of iris and rotting honeysuckle. From another room trickled the sound of water dripping steadily, as though a tap were running. He had to get out. He'd leave the door open. Police, a landlord, someone would call for help, but he couldn't reach the door. He couldn't stand. His feet skated across the slick tiles as his hands tore uselessly through the wads of petals. It grew darker. Golden bands rippled across the floor as sunlight filtered through gray curtains. Leo dragged himself through rotting leaves, his clothes sopping, tugging aside mats of greenery and broken branches. His leg ached where he'd fallen on it, and his hands stung, pricked by unseen thorns. Something brushed against his fingers, and he forced himself to look down, shuddering. A shattered nautilus left a thin red line across his hand, the sharp fragments gilded by the dying light. As he looked around, he noticed other things. Myriad small objects caught in the morass of rotting flowers, like a nightmarish ebb tide on the linoleum floor. Agates, and feathered masks. Birds of paradise plumes encrusted with mud. Cracked skulls and bones and cloth of gold. He recognized the carved puppet Helen had been playing with that afternoon in the Indonesian corridor, its headdress glittering in the twilight. About its neck was strung a plate of flowers, amber and cerulean blossoms glowing like phosphorescence among the ruins. Through the room echoed a dull clang. Leo jerked to his knees, relieved. Surely someone had knocked, but the sound came from somewhere behind him and was echoed in another, harsher note. As the second bell died, he heard the echo's feet pattering as they fled across the ceiling. A louder note rang out, the window panes vibrating to the sound as though wind battered. In the corner, the leaves of the ficus turned as if to welcome rain, and the rose bushes stirred. Leo heard something else then, a small sound like a cat stretching to wakefulness. Now both of his legs ached, and he had to pull himself forward on his hands and elbows, striving to reach the front door. The clanging grew louder, more resonant. A higher tone echoed it monotonously, like the echo of rain in a well. Leo glanced over his shoulder to the empty doorway that led to the kitchen, the dark mouth of the hallway to Helen's bedroom. Something moved there. As his elbow moved something else, and he struck at it feebly, knocking the puppet across the floor. Uncomprehending, he stared after it, then cowered as he watched the ceiling, wondering if one of the geckos had crept down beside him. There was no gecko. When Leo glanced back at the puppet, it was moving across the floor towards him, pulling itself forward on its long, slender arms. The gongs thundered now. A shape humped across the room, something large enough to blot out the empty doorway behind it. Before he was blinded by petals, Leo saw that it was a shrunken figure, a woman whose elongated arms clutched broken branches to propel herself, legs dragging uselessly through the tangled leaves. About her swayed a host of brilliant figures no bigger than dolls. They had roped her neck and hands with wreaths of flowers and scattered blossoms onto the floor about them. Like a flock of chattering butterflies, they surged towards him, tiny hands outstretched, their long tongues unfurling like crimson pistols, and the gongs rang like golden bells as they gathered about him to feed. What the fuck was that? Oh, I really enjoyed that, even though it was harder to read. Oh my god. Oof. Oh, hey. Sorry, I haven't been looking up at the reading. Again, that was Prince of Flowers by Elizabeth Hand. And oh my god, I like that more than the other one, which makes it sound like I didn't like the other one, but like it's just more my style, my preference. I really liked like where she worked was so interesting. Like, can I work at a museum and just like tag things all of the time? Never speak to anybody and maybe steal some things. I don't know. Don't hold that against me. Could do without the dude being weirdly jealous though. Jesus. Leave me alone, bro. Okay. I said I would do the next one. I can do that too. It's another long. It's like the same size as the others. I'm stumbling a lot. Sorry if that's annoying. Okay. The next one is Services Rendered by Louise Cooper. And I haven't the faintest notion how this story came into my head, admits the author. It just did. One moment I was racking my brain for a plot that would make for a slightly different twist on the vampire theme. The next, the complete idea was sitting grinning in my mind. That's unusual for me. The theme of services rendered came from a question that I find endlessly fascinating. How an ordinary, down-to-earth human being reacts when faced with the apparently impossible, especially so when that impossibility combines something terrifying, possibly, repellent, probably, and dangerous, potentially, with the lure of a dream come true scenario. As for vampires, I've yet to encounter one of the classical kind outside of a movie screen, and I sincerely hope it stays that way, but there are individuals whose effect on those around them has something in common with the vampire of legend, who seem to attach themselves to others and take nourishment from their energies. I saw Carmine as one of these individuals in addition to her more traditional qualities. Even vampires, if they exist, must surely have their hopes and fears and dreams like any ordinary person, however you define that. Interesting. Well, a different twist on the vampire theme is like the theme of the book so far, so we'll see. The cultured female voice at the other end of the phone line said, "I saw your advertisement in Alternatives. It's possible that I might be able to help." The sick lurch of hope had become all too familiar over the last few months, and Penny tried to ignore it and keep her mind neutral. "I see. What, exactly would you be suggesting?" There was a slight pause, then, "I'd guess from your tone that you've had other calls, yes? But nothing worthwhile came from them?" "You could say that." Hope turned sour as she recalled them. 2 fringe herbalists, a crystal healer, a woman trying to sell her a magic luck talisman, complete with a Your Personal Love Rhythms chart. Oh, and the crank who had banged on about Jesus and the wages of sin until she had sworn at him and slammed the receiver down. The magazine had advised her, when she placed the advert, not to include her home number. Desperate needs, though, called for desperate measures. "Look," Penny said, "if you're marketing some new miracle cure, then—" "Oh, no, it's nothing like that, I assure you. What I could offer is entirely practical and entirely effective. The only caveat is that the patient must be prepared to accept certain side effects." Hope began to creep back. Words such as patient and side effects were reassuring. They had a ring of orthodoxy. "May I ask you a question?" said the woman. Penny snapped back from the tangent her thoughts had abruptly taken. Yes, please do. You obviously couldn't go into detail in the advertisement. Is it your husband who's ill?" "Yes." "And the doctors say that, well, that there's nothing more they can do?" "Yes." "The GP, tests, the specialists, more tests, that loathsome hospital." Penny breathed deeply and carefully to knock the tremor out of her voice. "It's incurable, and it's progressive. Over the last 2 years, we've tried everything, but it didn't. And now he might have a couple of months, but the doctors say that—" Something caught in her throat. She turned her head aside from the receiver and tried to clear it. "That there's no hope," the woman gently finished the sentence for her. "I understand. I'm so sorry." "Thank you," Penny said tightly. "So then, I think I can help you if you want me to, but I prefer to talk about it face to face." Penny's cynicism had begun to come back in a reaction to the last few moments, and she demanded, "Why?" "That's the sort of thing the evangelists do. Warm an invitation, then start on their conversion technique. Only last week I answered the doorbell and there was some bloody— Please, I promise you, I'm not an evangelist in any shape or form, far from it, but what I need to explain really does need a personal meeting." Penny looked down the length of the hall. The thin February daylight made everything look bleak and depressing. The stairs were deeply shadowed, and David was lying up there in their bedroom, drugged to the eyeballs with painkillers, hardly knowing her, hardly knowing anything. "All right," she said, on an outward rush of breath. "When and where?" "It's best if I come to your house, I think. Would this evening be convenient?" "Yes. Face the thing quickly. If it's yet another disappointment, better to have it over with." Feeling that the situation wasn't quite real, Penny gave her address and agreed on 7 p.m. "I don't know your name," she added. "Oh, of course. It's Smith. Carmine Smith." Penny didn't believe that, and she didn't believe that the woman could be of any use at all, but what did it matter? There was nothing left to lose. Carmine Smith was probably in her early 40s, elegant in classically understated dark clothes and expensive black silk coat. Her hair, too, was dark, cut in a young gamine style that suited her perfectly. Her eyes were subtly made up, but she wore no lipstick. "Thank you," she said, taking the coffee, black, no sugar, that Penny handed to her. She looked around the room, assessing it, her expression inscrutable. Then she said, "Is your husband at home?" Penny nodded. "They said there was no point in his staying in hospital. They need the beds, and there's nothing." "Of course. Could I see him?" Penny became defensive. "He's probably asleep. He sleeps a lot, and even when he's awake, he's vague. He couldn't tell you much. All the same, if I could just look in." Carmine's eyes were very intense. Penny hesitated, then shrugged. They climbed the stairs. Carmine walked noiselessly, which Penny found faintly unsettling. She fancied that if she were to turn her head, she would find nobody at all behind her, and that this whole encounter was a delusion. David, as she had predicted, was asleep. Carmine moved to the bed and stood gazing down at him by the soft light of the bedside lamp, while Penny, who no longer liked to look at her husband too often, hovered by the window. At length, Carmine said quietly, "He's very handsome." "Yes." Or was, before he couldn't eat properly anymore and started to waste away. "How old is he?" 46. Penny moved restlessly. "Look, I don't want to wake him. You've seen him now. If we're going to talk, I'd prefer to do it downstairs." "Of course." Carmine led the way out with a confidence that she hadn't exhibited before, as if in the space of a few seconds she had absorbed, considered, and come to a conclusion. Back in the sitting room, she sat in what had always been David's favorite chair, sipped her coffee, then set the cup down and looked directly at Penny. "I can bring him back to you," she said. A crawling electrical sensation went through Penny's entire body, and she stared, disbelieving. "How?" Carmine steadied her own hands where they lay in her lap. "This is the hard part, Mrs. Blythe, the part you're going to find difficult to accept. You mentioned side effects?" Yes, but I'm not talking about those, not yet." She inhaled deeply. "Perhaps it's best if I put it more bluntly, rather than beating around the bush. I can restore your husband to you, whole and healthy, stronger than he has ever been before, because I can make him immortal." There was a brief, lacerating silence. Then Penny stood up. "Get out of my house," she said. "Now." "Mrs. Blythe." "Now," Penny repeated ferociously. "People like you, you're sick. I suppose you find it funny, do you, playing your jokes, having your laughs at someone else's expense? Some kind of turn on, is it?" She strode to the door, wrenched it open. "Get out." I love her. Carmine was also on her feet now, but she didn't leave. "Mrs. Blythe, I'm serious." She sounded almost angry, and Penny turned, thumping a clenched fist against the edge of the door. "Oh, she's serious. So it's not a sick joke. She really believes it. God give me strength." She swung round again. "What kind of a moron do you take me for? What kind of moron are you? Immortality," she says. "You're in some cult, right? Well, I'll tell you right now, Ms. Smith, or whatever your real name is, you have been brainwashed, and I'm not listening to another moment of this crap." "Mrs. Blythe," said Carmine, and something in her voice made Penny stop. "Mrs. Blythe, I do not belong to any cult or other organization, but I am immortal. And I am offering your husband the chance to be the same, because it's the only alternative he has to dying. You see, I'm a vampire." Penny pressed her forehead against the door frame and started to laugh. The laughter became hysterical, then turned into gulping, hiccuping sobs. Then she threw anything movable within her reach to Carmine, screaming abuse. Carmine avoided the missiles and waited calmly for the worst of the storm to pass. When it did, and Penny was slumped on her haunches against the wall with both hands covering her face, she said, "Have you got a mirror?" Penny raised her head and stared, but she didn't speak. Looking past her through the open door, Carmine saw an oval mirror hanging in the hall. She fetched it and crouched down at Penny's side. "Look in the glass," she said. Too drained to argue, Penny looked. She saw her own red-eyed, disheveled reflection, decided that she resembled an unhealthy pig, and even in extremity felt shamed. Then her brain caught up as she took in Carmine's image beside hers. In the mirror, Carmine had no face. She was nothing more than a vague gray blur, as if an isolated patch of fog had floated in and settled at Penny's shoulder. The fog dimly suggested a human-like shape, and there might have been a fading hint of features shrouded somewhere in it, but that was all. The superstition that we're invisible in mirrors isn't quite accurate, said Carmine mildly, but it's close enough. She stood up, saving the glass as Penny's numb fingers lost their grip on it, and stepped back a pace or two to show that she meant no threat. What else can I do to convince you? Very slowly, Penny's head came up. She looked shocked, confused, and there was a witless, corpse-like grin on her face. Garlic, she said. Vampires can't stand garlic, and they turn to dust if sunlight touches them. She flung a swift glance towards the window, but the curtains were closed. It was dark outside. She had forgotten that. Not true, Carmine told her. Personally, I adore garlic. In sunlight, well, we find it debilitating, and our skin tends to burn more easily than most people's, but it doesn't do any lasting damage. Penny persisted. Coffins, then. They sleep in coffins. Again, not true. I did try it once, when I was a child, but one night was enough to make me see sense. Beds are far more comfortable. Carmine smiled wryly. It's Chinese whispers, isn't it? Stories become exaggerated and distorted as they're passed from one person to another until you end up with a mixture of fact and fiction. That's how the folklore about us grew up over this. Okay, that's just racism, right? That's why we call it, like, telephone. Chinese whispers. Where did they even come from? Centuries. Penny repeated dully, then uttered a peculiar little bark of a laugh. How old are you? Far older than any woman wants to admit to. Okay. In my case, the condition's hereditary. It's another myth, by the way, that vampires can only be made, not born. Either is possible. Which brings us back to David. No, said Penny. Mrs. Blythe. No. Anyway, I don't believe any of this. You mean you don't want to believe it? Look at me. Please. Just so that I can show you something. Her teeth, of course. The canines were abnormally long, not outright Dracula fangs, but certainly not pronounced. They looked sharp, too. Penny giggled stupidly, and Carmine said, if you still won't believe me, then there's only one other way I can prove my bona fides. The giggling stopped, and Penny eyed her suspiciously. What's that? Begin the treatment. Carmine raised her gaze meaningfully upwards, in the direction of the bedroom. And before you shout at me again, consider. I can't do anything to damage him, because he's already terminally damaged. So what have you got to lose? That's a horrible argument. I mean, he's already dying, so, like, when you, like, literally, like, torturing a man, I mean, he's gonna die in, like, a week anyway. Still don't torture him. What? Penny's rational self, what was left of it, said, this is completely insane. I'm talking to a woman who claims to be a vampire and claims she can give David his life back by turning him into one too. And part of me wants that ludicrous impossibility to be true because anything's better than losing him. And so here I stand on the verge of saying yes. Go ahead then. Let's see if you really can do it. She heard herself say aloud. Go ahead then. Let's see if you really can do it. She turned away from Carmine and stared at the wall. As you said, what have I got to lose? The most likely scenario is that you're barking mad and you'll jump around and shout mumbo jumbo and nothing will happen. But okay, why not? I wouldn't have put that ad in pleading for a cure if I hadn't been ready to try just about anything. She stopped then and frowned. What will you actually do? Bite him, said Carmine levelly. That part of the myth is accurate. The first session won't do much. He'll need several. But it will set the ball rolling, so to speak. You might even find his health starts to improve straight away. Sure, Penny waved a hand. Unreal. Maybe I've flipped and it isn't happening at all. What the hell? Go on then. Yes, go on. Okay. Just gonna send a stranger up to bite my husband. Carmine wouldn't let Penny accompany her upstairs. They argued about that, but in the end Penny gave way. Instead she paced the hall, listening but hearing nothing, until footsteps moved overhead to the bathroom. There was a splashing of water, then Carmine came back down the staircase. Is that it? Penny asked. She had half expected to see some change in the woman, but apart from the fact that her cheeks looked a little less pale than before, there was nothing discernible. For the time being, Carmine told her, I'll go now. See how he is over the next 48 hours. She took her coat from the hook and started to put it on. Wait, Penny said. Yes? Why are you doing this? I mean, if what you claim is true, and you are She couldn't quite bring herself to utter the word. There's got to be something in it for you. There is, said Carmine. Money. It was the last answer Penny had expected, and she blinked, thrown. What? Carmine shrugged. Everyone has to earn a living. If your husband improves and you decide to go on with the treatment, then I'll expect you to pay me a fee. What sort of fee? I usually charge $10,000. That's assuming the treatment is completed. If you decide to stop at any stage, we'll work out a percentage. 10,000? I don't wish to be rude, said Carmine, but what price would you put on your husband's future? When one thought about it, it was, of course, a perfectly reasonable business deal. The car had cost twice that, and the market value of the house was in a different league altogether. As Carmine pointed out, what price David's future? Nonetheless, in her naivety, Penny had assumed that Carmine must be motivated by some unspecified altruism, and to find out that she was as hard-nosed as any showroom salesman or estate agent was something of a shock. She laughed, choked, collected herself. It's not exactly the NHS rate, is it? No, Carmine agreed. The outer edges of her mouth twitched faintly. Strictly private, I'm afraid. The car could go. It must still be worth at least $8,000. 2 more wouldn't be impossible to find. All right, Penny said. If it works. She pressed her knuckles to her brow. I don't believe I'm doing this. Carmine produced a silver-edged business card. My office number's on it, she said. Call me the day after tomorrow, and we'll take it from there. Penny looked at the card. Carmine Smith, consultant. That's what you call yourself, is it? It's a useful word. Covers a multitude of sins. The hint of a smile increased and became faintly wicked. Good night, Penny. May I call you Penny now? We'll speak soon. She saw herself out. David Blythe did not wake that evening, but slept through the night as peacefully as a child without the aid of drugs. With movies in mind, Penny examined his neck for puncture marks. She found nothing and went to bed in the adjoining room, where she had long periods of uneasy wakefulness, with bouts of bad dreams between them. David woke shortly after 7 and told her that he was feeling very little pain. The smallest hint of color alleviated the gray illness in his face. He slept again through the morning. At lunchtime he ate half a bowl of soup and didn't vomit it back. Then he slept again, ate a little more, and had a second peaceful night. By the following morning, Penny had forgotten the 48-hour agreement, and at 10 a.m. she was dialing the number on Carmine Smith's card. He's better, she said in a tiny, frightened voice. I don't understand, and I almost daren't believe it, but he's so much better. Yes, said Carmine, with a certain satisfaction. 10,000 then? 10,000, Penny repeated. Oh, God, yes. She came to the house 4 more times. On each occasion, the routine was the same. Coffee first, then the walk upstairs, leaving Penny nervously pacing, then the bathroom, then goodbye. Once she did accept a glass of burgundy after her visit to the bedroom, but that was all. As yet, she had asked for no payment, and when Penny tentatively raised the subject, she only shook her head and said that she preferred to take fee on completion. Either she was trusting, Penny decided, or her clients could be too frightened to try to renege on the agreement. At Carmine's insistence, David knew nothing of what was going on. Though his health was rapidly improving, he still slept a great deal, so the visits were timed accordingly. Penny eased her conscience by telling herself that, had he been consulted, David would have gladly chosen anything as an alternative to death. Sure, I still think you should feel a little bit guilty about it, but fine. Then one evening, as they sipped their ritual coffee, Carmine said that tonight's visit would be her last. Penny's hand and cup stopped midway to her mouth. Why? What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Carmine set her own cup down. It's simply that the initial stage of the cure is complete. It's time for the second and final stage. She was gazing steadily at Penny, and with an inner curling sensation, Penny realized that she had not prepared herself for this. Carmine had explained, or tried to, the nature and the consequences of what would eventually happen to David, the way he would live, the way he would eat, the heightened energy, the fact that he would not age but remain as he was for, well, in theory, forever. Penny had had pretended to listen, but in fact Carmine's words had flowed through her and passed her without taking hold in her mind. She hadn't wanted to know the details. All that mattered to her was that David was slowly but surely gaining his life back. Now, though, the reality of the situation hit her with a jolt that made her feel sick. Tonight, if Carmine had her way, David would become what she was, a vampire. Penny believed in vampires now. Carmine claimed to be such a creature, and in the light of the miracle that had been wrought, how could she doubt anything that Carmine said? Vampire. Then, finding the pronoun utterly pointless, she fell silent. Carmine did not drink any more coffee. She merely waited, and at last Penny found a semblance of a question. What will you do? What I've done before. Carmine's voice was quiet, soothing, irrationally, the tone of it reassured. But to a greater degree. I'd rather not tell you the details. They might upset you. And there are some things that we find uncomfortable to expose to those who aren't of our kind. David. Vampire. Will you hurt him? Not at all. I guarantee it. My husband. Then Penny faced the question she really wanted to ask, the only one that mattered. Will he die? She thought Carmine might fudge that one, possibly out of delicacy or kindness, or for more obscure reasons. She didn't. She said as casually as if referring to the workings of a car engine. Technically, yes. He'll be out. That is, not breathing. For something like 12 hours. Then he'll wake and, she spread her hands. That's it. My husband. Undead. A vampire. Oh, one warning, Carmine added. 12 hours is a long time to wait. It'll probably feel more like 12 days to you. You could easily panic and think that something's gone wrong, but you must not be tempted to act on that fear. If you call a doctor, an ambulance, anything like that, the consequences will be disastrous, and I am not exaggerating. One hand resting on the arm of her chair, clenched as though an unpleasant memory had risen. Imagine it, Penny, a dead man who suddenly and inexplicably returns to life. Believe me, you do not want to condemn David and yourself to facing the results of that. Penny nodded. She was feeling worse with every moment, and suddenly she found herself on the verge of changing her mind, ordering Carmine out of the house as she had done at their first encounter. I'm afraid, Carmine said softly, that it's a little late for that. Penny stared. How do you know what you're thinking? Don't worry. I'm not telepathic. It's simply all there in your face. Cold feet, the last-minute doubts. It's always the same, but you can't turn back. He's already too far down the line, and if it stops now, he'll die sooner and more unkindly than he would have done if this had never begun. She stood up. So, with your permission, Penny's face was a frozen sculpture. She nodded once, barely perceptibly, and Carmine silently left the room. She was gone longer than usual, and when she returned, Penny had not been pacing but sat still, motionless in her chair. 12 hours, Carmine said. Her cheeks were flushed, and there was an excited, faintly feverish look in her eyes. For his sake and yours, please remember what I said, and don't panic. Penny didn't look at her, but fumbled for her handbag on the floor near her feet. I'd better, she swallowed. The car was sold. The money was in the bank. She wanted rid of it. Will you take the check? Of course. While Penny wrote, her hand shaking, Carmine put her coat on. Thank you, she said. The check disappeared into a small black leather wallet. Oh, and if you need me again, just phone. It's inclusive, no extra charge. Need you? Penny demanded sharply. For what? Well, you may already have worked out how to do it, in which case there's no problem, said Carmine. But if you haven't... Her shoulders shifted in an eloquent but slightly self-effacing way. You might want some help when you have to break the news of what we've done to David. Penny sat beside her husband's bed, her gaze fixed glassily on his face, her body and mind numb. David wasn't breathing, and she had got through nearly half a bottle of vodka, and if Carmine's calculation was right, there was still 9 more hours to endure before his chest would move, and his eyes would open and look at her, and she would have to tell him the truth. She didn't know how she would do it, and she wished that she had the bare-faced gall to pray for guidance, but she didn't, and so, waiting the hours away with the help of the vodka bottle seemed the only viable option. At midnight, she was asleep, slumped forward with her face on the bed, in a posture that would give her a diabolical backache by morning. At 7:45 a.m., a sound and a movement disturbed her, and she raised her head blearily. Her eyes wouldn't focus properly at first, but after a second or two, David's face registered. He was awake. He was sitting up. and he was hungry. Champagne, Carmine produced a bag with a refinedly understated logo and presented it to Penny to mark the occasion and celebrate a happy outcome. The champagne was expensive and already chilled to the perfect temperature, both of which made Penny feel faintly inadequate. She said thank you too gushingly, but before she could make any move to open the bottle, David took it from her. Let me, darling. You know what you're like. You'll struggle with it, and then it'll go off bang, and we'll lose half the contents before we even start. The remark stung Penny, but she didn't want to show it. She returned a stiff smile, fetched glasses, watched as the cork came out with nothing more than a soft hiss, and the champagne bubbled into the bowls. Carmine was given the first glass. Naturally enough, she was a guest. Penny the second. Well then, David raised the third glass, to all of us, but he was looking at Carmine as he said it. Carmine smiled warmly. They drank. Then a constrained silence crept in. Penny said, I'll see how the food's coming along. All right, she told herself in the kitchen. This is still very new to him, and she's been more than helpful. In fact, I very much doubt if we could have coped without her. Stop resenting her and stop being paranoid. Lecture over. If she repeated it often enough, the message would get through eventually. There was no cause to be suspicious. She started to prepare the food, trying to concentrate on the filleted sole she had prepared for herself, and not dwell too much on what David and Carmine were to eat. Only a desire not to alienate David had stopped her from staggering meal times so that they no longer sat together at the dinner table. She frankly couldn't bear to watch him. She had always been squeamish about red meat, and in the past their meals had majored on fish, chicken, or vegetarian dishes. All that had changed now, and if David's diet wasn't as grotesque as legend, it was still bad enough, and the way he ate, the speed, the relish of it. Meat, especially beef or veal, either totally raw or so rare that the blood still ran and congealed on his plate, and fish only in the form of sushi. He enjoyed jagged hair if the local butcher could provide one complete with blood. When the butcher did, Penny had put her foot down and told David that he must cook it himself. No vegetables whatsoever, no fruit or cereals or grains. Oh, and the daily breakfast of raw eggs and black pudding, of course. Alcohol wasn't a problem, though he had a marked preference for the heavier red wines, and he did not get drunk no matter how much he put away. All of that is so gross. Make your husband cook his own meals. Jesus Christ, that's disgusting. Tonight, with two of David's kind to cater for, Penny had forced herself to provide filet steak, cooking omitted, with a creamy and plentiful pepper sauce that she could pour on before serving to mask the look and the smell. Vegetables would also be served, but only she herself would touch them. Ditto the tiramisu she had prepared for dessert. These guys are rich. Damn. She was not looking forward to the evening. During the early, difficult stage, she smiled humorlessly at that piece of light to tease. What the fuck? Carmine had been a rock to her, a mediator and ally in the painful process of getting David through the initial shock and enabling him to come to terms with what he had become. That nightmare was over now, though, and the idea that Carmine should come to dinner on a purely social basis, thus shifting the relationship between the three of them from the professional to the personal, dismayed Penny. She did not want Carmine as a friend. The woman unnerved her, understandably, and now that she was no longer needed, Penny would have vastly preferred never to set eyes on her again. David, though, had argued that one invitation was the very least they could do to thank Carmine. Anything less would be downright rude, he had said, and considering that without her intervention, Penny would now be a widow, he found her attitude hard to understand and more than a little disappointing. You know what? Fuck you. David, fuck off. I'm allowed to... Your wife's allowed to hate someone she's known for a couple months. He had expected better of her. Fuck off. Feeling like a petty-minded schoolgirl, Penny had flushed and capitulated and spent the rest of the day torn between feelings of shame and guilt and fervent hopes that Carmine would decline the invitation. But Carmine had not declined, so the motions must be gone through, and David would be pleased. and when it was over, she could, with luck, bid Carmine a final adieu. The meal progressed in decorous, civilized style, only marred for Penny if one overlooked the actual content of the food by the amount of wine that David and Carmine drank. It wasn't that she really minded, Penny told herself. It wasn't as if either of them became drunk or obnoxious, but Carmine's contribution was only the one bottle of champagne. They had paid for the rest, and considering that 10,000 pounds of their money was now sitting in her bank account, she pushed the thought away. The matter of the money was niggling at her too often for comfort, and she reminded herself that, as Carmine had said at the time, would price her husband's future. David had been what he was for 4 months now, and even in her meanest moments, Penny had to acknowledge that the condition had its advantages. Take the sex, for instance. Through their married life, he had never had a high sex drive. It had been a bone of contention at times, and once his illness set in, any question of conjugal rights had gone straight out of the window. Penny had never complained, naturally, but she had suffered a lot of frustration. Not so now. Now, David was tireless, inventive too, and so keen that in fact his demands were starting to become exhausting and just a little tedious. Ice cream is delectable, but too much makes you sick. Penny pushed the thought away too, and tried to shake her mind out of its bout of self-pity. What did the money matter, or the small irritations? David was alive, well, but no, don't go down that path. Strong and guaranteed to remain that way for... The word hit her suddenly and hard. Forever. David wasn't going to age. As years passed, he would remain exactly as he was tonight while she... Penny, Carmine's voice snapped the chain of the horror rising in her. Is anything wrong? Oh, no, of course nothing's wrong, only that I'm such a cretin that I've only just started to consider the implication of immortality. Penny said in such a peculiarly strangled voice that she gave the complete lie to the statement. No, something stuck in my throat, I think. She might have imagined it, but Penny thought Carmine and David exchanged a very private look. Not a fishbone, I hope, Carmine said solicitously. They can be dangerous. Can I... No, she swallowed. Thank you. It's gone now. She took a large and unladylike swig from her wine glass, and this time distinctly saw David raise an eyebrow. More, darling? No trace of disapproval in his voice, but he was good at hiding things. Always had been, now she thought about it. Yes, thanks. Defiantly, she emptied the refilled glass in one, challenging him to make any comment. He didn't. It was a lovely meal, Penny, Carmine said, possibly to ease the sudden sharp change in the atmosphere. Absolutely, David concurred before Penny could think of a reply. We must do it again, mustn't we? Penny opened her mouth to snap. Must we? But had the wit to close it again before anything came out. David offered Carmine coffee, and when Penny showed no sign of volunteering to make it, he headed to the kitchen to do it himself. Penny watched him go, tall, slim. That old tendency to put on weight had quite gone, and he looked extremely handsome these days. And as he disappeared, a question sprang into her mind. It was a spin-off from the immortality thing. She was feeling calmer about that, though doubtless it would come back and hit her again later. And suddenly she wanted, extremely badly, to know the answer. She turned to Carmine. May I ask you something? Of course. Carmine inclined her head in a way that made Penny wonder if she was being patronized. Third thought to push away. It's about children. Ah. Carmine's expression grew wary. I've been wondering if that would come up. Penny bristled, though not visibly. I think it's a natural enough concern, whatever David might. You didn't have children before. Was that choice or... Choice, of course. Her hackles were rising by the moment, and she wished she had not begun the conversation. Too late for regret, though, and with determination she collected herself. It's a perfectly straightforward question. Can we? Carmine said, no. Penny's bravado and aggression collapsed. Why not? Carmine's eyes held a world of sympathy, even if Penny was unwilling to acknowledge it. She's such a bitch. It's a hard fact of our condition, she said. A vampire can procreate, naturally. Our kind would have died out in the earliest days, maybe never even have evolved in the first place when you think about it logically. Chickens and eggs, you know. She saw Penny's face become very tight and quickly let the metaphor drop. I was born what I am, and I could make a child with any man, mortal or otherwise. David, though, was not born what he is, and when the condition isn't hereditary, the rules are different. He could only father a child on a woman who was vampire born, but with you, it isn't possible. Penny's mind spun off into space, and her lungs seemed to be clogging up with something murky and angry and bitter. So, she said, you could have a child with my husband, but I can't. What did that pause signify? Anything? Nothing? At length, Carmine did answer. Yes, theoretically. Theoretically, Penny asked, have you had any children? Carmine broke eye contact and looked away. It was the first time Penny had ever known her to do that. Yes. Penny's bitterness was growing, and with it a desperate desire to strike out, to hurt. Because she was hurting. She wanted Carmine to suffer along with her. Where are they now? She demanded. She's such a bitch. The second pause was longer than the first. Then, one, Carmine said, apparently without emotion, is in New York. Or was the last time I heard anything of him. He's a heroin addict, and he wants to die of it, but he can't because of what he is. The other, her voice caught momentarily. Cat scratching at the cat scratcher. Do you mind? The other, her voice caught momentarily, did die, though she was the one who didn't want to. Ironic, yes. But it was a long time ago, and a long way east of here, and people believed in us then. So when she made a serious tactical mistake, She coughed. Well, you know how the legend runs. The method of killing us is one of the facts that hasn't been distorted. Penny stared, fascination creeping in despite herself. A stake through the heart? She prompted softly. Carmine nodded. Her face had tightened, taking on the look of a fixed clay mask. It doesn't actually have to be a stake, she said. Anything will do, as long as it pierces far enough. In her case... Your daughter? Carmine swallowed. My daughter, yes. In her case, it was a kitchen knife. Just a kitchen knife. David came back then. Coffee's brewing, he began cheerfully, then saw Carmine's tension, the expression on Penny's face. What is it? His tone became sharp. What's happened? Penny mouthed, tell you later, but he didn't see it. His attention was on Carmine. She, however, straightened her shoulders and smiled up at him. Nothing to concern you, she said lightly. Women's talk, that's all. David, when we've had coffee, I really must go. It's been a lovely evening, but I have to be up tomorrow. I've got an early appointment. Penny wanted to say bitchily, another 10 grand in the bank, but held her tongue. It wasn't the moment for scoring points. In a few minutes more, Carmine would be out of here. She disciplined herself to make polite and superficially pleasant small talk while the coffee was enjoyed, and they all had a cognac. Then David fetched Carmine's coat and walked her to her car. Penny watched covertly from the window, but it was too dark to see what sort of car she had. Something expensive, no doubt. She could afford it, couldn't she? And why was a simple farewell taking so long? What were they doing? When David did return, 6 minutes, Penny had counted. She was washing up with a pointed amount of noise and splashing. Before his illness, he had promised to buy her a dishwasher. Out of the question now, of course. They couldn't afford it. As she slammed another plate into the rack, he came up behind her and slid his hands around her waist. Leave that. I'll do it in the morning. His lips touched the back of her neck. Come to bed. Oh, God, not again. I'm tired, she said. Let's give it a miss tonight, shall we? He laughed. No way. I want you. Come on, darling. I'm not taking no for an answer. You never do you? Penny pulled a face that he couldn't see and sighed. No point in arguing. She would waste more time and energy that way than by giving him what he wanted yet again. She pulled off her rubber gloves, dumped them on the draining board, and went with him up the stairs. Maybe he'd have less energy to get it on all the time if he made his own meals. And went outside sometimes. David always fell soundly asleep after sex, and when she was certain of not disturbing him, Penny got up and went into the bathroom. Switching on the small vanity light, she faced her reflection in the mirror above the wash basin. On first impression, she was pretty good for 43, but she wasn't in a mood to be optimistic, and she studied herself more closely and critically. Crow's feet at the borders of her eyes, lines developing at the corners of her mouth, chin starting to sag, barely noticeable yet, but she could see it. She wasn't a natural blonde, so couldn't tell if there were any traces of gray in her hair yet. Gray was distinguishing in a man, aging in a woman. Carmine wasn't gray, was she? Carmine could have his child. I can't. It wasn't that she wanted children. Never had, really. She wasn't the maternal type. No shit. But the but the principle of the thing was different, and the thought that Carmine and David were capable of doing what she and David weren't made her very, very angry. It also led quite naturally from the perspective of this dissatisfied moment to the conclusion that if they could, they just might. That tonight she had possibly witnessed the opening gambits of a sexual affair, or even if she hadn't, that the potential was there. Potential or inevitability. Penny leaned closer still to the mirror, dissecting her image now. Even if lines and gray hair weren't yet worth worrying about, that would change soon enough. Think forward 3 years, 5, 10. In 10 years she would be 53. In 15, 60 would be looming on her horizon, but David would still be exactly as he was tonight, youthful, energetic, handsome. What would he want with a 60-year-old wife? She would be a turnoff, an embarrassment, and that would be the end of it. Marriage over. Goodbye. David was no fool. He must have considered the long-term future. Maybe he had even discussed it with Carmine in some private conversation that Penny knew nothing about. Penny's stomach churned at the thought of him talking to Carmine, possibly meeting Carmine, when she was not present to play chaperone, or gooseberry. Remember how he kept looking at her tonight? Are they already having an affair? Are they? Suddenly she felt tainted, and with the feeling came an overwhelming urge to walk back into the bedroom, shake David forcibly awake, and confront him with her suspicions. Or to go to the phone, key Carmine's number, and demand the truth from her. Yes, that was the better option, because if there was an affair, David would lie about it, and she was too vulnerable to his charm not to be taken in. If Carmine lied, Penny would not be fooled. Yes, the better option. In the morning, when David had left for work, she would do it. Penny did not make the planned phone call, for by morning she had thought of a new idea, so radical that at first it shocked her, and she mentally hid from it, finding 100 reasons why it was utterly out of the question. Through the first half of the day, though, the reasons seemed somehow to break down of their own accord, until by mid-afternoon they were gone, leaving in their place the same kind of queasy, heart-racing excitement that young children feel on the night before Christmas when nothing can persuade them to sleep. With an hour to go before David came home, she summoned the courage to ring Carmine. Carmine said, "No, I'm sorry, Penny, but I just won't do it." With her world collapsing around her, Penny screamed down the phone. "Why not, damn you? You were eager enough to do it for David. What's the bloody difference all of a sudden?" She sucked in a huge, painful breath. "I know it's all business to you, but I can find the money. Penny, listen to me. Have you talked to David about this?" "No, I haven't." "Then I think you should. And I also think I know what he'll say." Penny saw red. "David's not my bloody owner. I'll make my own decisions. And how the hell would you know what he'd say? Telepathic, are you? Or are you so cozy with my husband these days that you know him better than I do?" "I'm not saying that. I'm only saying..." "What are you saying? Tell me the truth for once." "I'm trying to." "The circumstances aren't the same, Penny. David was terminally ill, and what I did for him was the only alternative to death. It isn't like that with you. You're healthy, and with a long, normal life ahead of you. It wouldn't be right to turn you into. But I want it." With a great effort, Penny brought herself under control. "Keep your temper," reasoned with her. "Look, I've thought it through. I have no doubts, and I can get the money. Don't you want another 10,000? Carmine gave a strange little laugh. "Money doesn't come into it. You could offer me $500,000 and I'd turn it down. The plain fact is I will not do this for any living soul unless there is a very, very good reason indeed. And my reason isn't good enough. No, frankly, it isn't." "I see. So you're happy to give David your gift, but you won't consider giving it to me. It isn't like that, Penny." "No, I'm sure it isn't." Then something dawned, and Penny wondered why on earth she hadn't thought of it before. "Well, I won't bother you again, then. I'll ask my husband to do it for me instead. He is my husband, after all, which is something you seem to conveniently forget when it suits you." There was a sharp pause. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Work it out, Carmine. You're intelligent enough." Penny was completely calm now. Yes, David can do it. Fool I am. I needn't even have made this call. Coolly, she added. I won't take up any more of your time. Oh, one last thing. You're not welcome in this house from now on. She didn't hang up immediately. She wanted to hear and savor Carmine's reaction. There was a short silence. Then Carmine said, "Message understood. But before you go, it's only fair to tell you that David can't help you, even if he agreed to it, which I frankly doubt. He doesn't possess the ability. Only those who are born to the club, as you might say, can initiate new members. Goodbye, Penny. I think I feel rather sorry for you." Carmine was the one to break the connection. Penny did not tell David about the phone call, and she did not ask him to do what she wanted. Instead, she kept the memory of the conversation locked privately in her mind, picking over every detail until it festered like a sore that wouldn't heal. David can't. Was that true, or had Carmine lied for her own purposes? I doubt if he would agree. How did she know what David would or wouldn't agree to? Discussed it, had they? How often? How intimately? Your reason isn't good enough. Carmine Smith, a.k.a. God. Well, the motive was obvious, wasn't it? Wives get in the way. She's insane. Wives get in the way of affairs, and the last thing Carmine and David would want was Penny joining the club, as Carmine had put it. Penny would cramp their style. Penny would be a damned nuisance. So she must be prevented from joining, mustn't she? Provided Penny stayed in the ranks of ordinary mortals, Carmine and David need only wait a few years. Nothing to them. Until Penny began seriously to age, then faded, withered, and finally dropped out of the picture altogether. Problem solved. Until then, they could simply carry on their liaison behind her back. The dark thoughts hung on Penny like a shroud all evening. David must have been aware of it, but he made no comment, which to her only compounded his guilt. She refused sex that night. Unusually, he didn't try too hard to persuade her, slept badly, and when it was time for him to get up, lay still and silent, pretending that the alarm clock hadn't woken her. It fooled David. He dressed silently, then went downstairs to make his own breakfast as she had begun to insist he should do. Then the phone rang. It was unusually early for anyone to call, and Penny raised her head from the pillow. David answered it on the kitchen extension, and the kitchen was directly below their bedroom, so his side of the conversation carried clearly. David Blythe. Oh, hi. This is a surprise. No, it's all right. What? When? Well, I don't. Oh, well, yes. Perhaps we should. Okay. 12:45 suit you? Right. I'll meet you there. Click. End of call. When he had eaten and came back upstairs, Penny yawned and stretched and put on a sleepy voice. Who was that on the phone? David had his back to her and was putting on his tie. He didn't use a mirror. There was no point. I told you about that new client, didn't I? No. Well? Well, it was his secretary, just changing the time of a meeting. Bloody nuisance. I've got a lot of other things scheduled today. He turned and glanced at her. You all right? Fine. Go on. Go away. I've got something to find out, and I don't want you around while I do it. He left a few minutes later. Penny listened to the sounds of the troublesome car eventually starting. An old banger. We all know what happened to the decent one, don't we? And as soon as he drove away, she picked up the phone and keyed recall to see who had really phoned. The number given was local, but not familiar. Could be the supposed client's secretary, however. Penny entered the code that would stop her own call being traced, then punched the number in. A ringing tone began. Click. Carmine Smith? Penny hung up. Carmine. Not at her office, but obviously at home. Well, now she had all her answers. New client. Oh, sure. You bastard. You two-faced, lying, cheating, cold-blooded bastard. And that, although she didn't realize it until quite some time afterwards, was the moment when everything was set in train. She's crazy. She watched. Oh, she watched. And she listened. And at every opportunity, she searched through David's clothes, David's wallet, anything that David was unsuspecting enough to leave lying around for her. For 6 days, she found nothing. Then on the 7th evening, while he was in the bath, the incriminating evidence finally appeared. Penny did not know whether to feel triumphant or sick as she read the scribbled note at the back of David's diary. It said simply, Carmine, the scream, Friday, 12:30. Not last Friday, because she'd looked in the diary more recently than that. Today was Thursday. Tomorrow, then. The Scream was a new minimalist cafe. Penny had suggested to David that they go there, but he had poo-pooed the idea, dismissing it as an overpriced trap for fashion victims. Now she knew why. Not exactly sensible to take one's wife to the same place where one met one's mistress. Noises from the bathroom announced David emerging, and hastily Penny replaced the diary in the inner pocket of his jacket. 12:30 tomorrow. Good. It would be the final proof. The rain gave her the advantage of anonymity. It was easy to loiter next door to the cafe, hiding under a plain black umbrella and pretending to window shop. Sheer good fortune staged the meeting as if it had been scripted. David arrived on foot, and as he reached the doorway, a taxi drew up and Carmine got out. Heart thudding painfully, Penny watched sidelong as they moved towards each other and saw Carmine reach up to kiss her husband. It was not a sisterly kiss, and Penny waited no longer, but turned and quietly and unnoticed walked away. She therefore didn't see David's reaction to the kiss, didn't see him lay his hands on Carmine's upper arms and push her gently away. Carmine hesitated, searching his face, and what she saw there changed her expression. A small smile, a regretful and half-apologetic shrug. Then they went into the cafe together. Okay. I'm sorry, Carmine stirred her coffee but showed no inclination to drink it. Yes, I confess I did hope that maybe something might develop between us. I'd be a liar if I didn't admit to finding you very attractive, and as we're both... Well, it seemed logical somehow. David thought the morality of that was dubious, but didn't comment. He's better than me. Apology accepted, he said, and maybe under different circumstances. Thank you for being so tactful about it, but I overstepped the mark. I simply didn't realize how strongly you feel about Penny. I love her, he said, and I don't want to lose her. When you called the first time and told me that she'd asked you to do what she'd asked you to do, it shocked me. Good God, can these people not talk to each other? Also, Carmine, you're an asshole. You're a narc. When you called me the first time and told me that she'd asked you to do, it shocked me. I hadn't faced it before, hadn't thought through the implications of what I'd become and what it'll mean to us in the future. Now, though, you want me to do it. She looked down at the table. Yes, so that Penny and I can stay together. His fingers moved restlessly. I know it's a great deal to ask, Carmine, especially when I've disappointed you. He shook his head quickly. Christ, that sounds so arrogant. I didn't mean, forget it. I haven't lived as long as I have without developing a very thick skin. Yes, as it is a great deal to ask, but you're asking it out of love, and I'd have a hard time coping with my conscience if I used love as an excuse for refusing. David's eyes lit. Then, I'll do it. Not for money. I won't accept payments this time. She raised her head, seemed to force herself to meet his gaze, and smiled. Call it my love token for you. I don't like her. My love token for you? Oh, God. There was a brief silence, then David let out a long breath and relaxed in his chair. Thank you. I don't know how to tell you what this means to me. Then don't try. One of her hands under the table clenched until the fingernails dug painfully into her flesh. I could begin this evening, she added after a few moments. Sooner the better, yes? Then I'll be out of your hair for good. I don't know what to say, Carmine. You're making a habit of those don't knows. She manufactured a laugh to show that was a joke. I'll come to your house at 8 o'clock then? 8 o'clock, yes. Thank you. Carmine stood up to leave, her coffee still untouched. It might be better if you don't tell Penny before I arrive. She isn't very well disposed towards me at the moment. That'll change. Ah, my consolation and reward for services rendered. Her mouth twitched with a sad drollery. I'll see you this evening. Oh, and a glass or two of a decent Bordeaux or Burgundy would be welcome afterwards. Goodbye, David. Can these people just not speak to each other? God. He hadn't intended to say a word to Penny about it, but when he walked into the house and saw her tight face and tense posture, he wanted to cheer her into a happier mood. So he kissed her. She responded stiffly and said, I've got a surprise for you. Oh? Penny eyed him uncertainly, wishing she could hate him for what he was doing to her. You'll find out what it is at 8 o'clock when Carmine arrives. Carmine? She stared at him, her eyes glaring disbelief and outrage. But David was already on his way upstairs and didn't see the change. That's right. No need to worry about food. She won't be eating with us. But I've bought some wine. If you open it now, it can breathe for an hour or two. Just going to have a quick shower and get changed. His voice diminished up the stairs, and Penny stood motionless in the living room doorway. She hadn't taken in his exact words, hadn't listened to them. One word, one name, was all that had registered. All afternoon she had been preparing herself for the great confrontation, when she would hurl down what she had seen today like a gauntlet and challenge him to deny it. Now all her plans were thrown into chaos. He had preempted her and snatched the advantage. Carmine was coming here. He had invited her, as if there was nothing between them, nothing to hide, nothing going on. What surprise had they cooked up between them to mollify her, put her off the scent? They must think she was a fool, a moron, to be taken in by their games. Upstairs in the bedroom, David was singing as he stripped off. He had a good baritone voice, but now it grated hatefully on Penny's ears. Fool, dupe, tainted, taken for granted, used, mocked. A huge and uncontrollable rage was rising inside her like a storm tide, and though a small part of her brain warned her it was a kind of madness, another part welcomed it because it was better, so much better, than the pain of enduring betrayal and making no effort to counter it. Penny moved at last. Down the hall, into the kitchen. Footfalls overhead. David was in the... Sorry, I just realized what the weird noise was. It was my cat doing something stupid. Medusa. I'm in a very important part of the story. Penny's insane. Oh, God. Counter it. Penny moved at last. Down the hall into the kitchen. Footfalls overhead. David was in the bathroom now. Faint sound of the shower running. He stopped singing. I don't ever want to hear him sing again. She opened one of the kitchen drawers at random, looked inside, closed it. Her mind wasn't functioning properly. It was the rage that was doing it, blocking logic, blocking efficient reasoning, and leaving her only with a robotic level of half-conscious reflex to drive her. Second drawer. No, not in there. Third. It doesn't actually have to be a stake. Anything will do, as long as it pierces far enough. Carmine's own words. Her daughter had died that way, caught out by, how had Carmine phrased it? A tactical mistake. That was it. Found out, unmasked for what she was, and summarily executed without a judge, jury, or lawyer in sight. It must have happened a long time ago, of course. A century, 2 centuries. Carmine was coy about her age, so she hadn't put a date on the event. Attitudes were different then. This was the modern world, a rational age. People didn't do such things, did they? As long as it pierces far enough. Penny took the cook's knife with the 8-inch blade out of its plastic sheath in the drawer and started to weigh and balance it gently in her palm. Good God. Carmine was 15 minutes late, but that didn't matter. Penny heard a car approach and slowed down and settled herself more comfortably in her cross-legged position on the hall floor. It would take Carmine a minute or so to park. Spaces were always tight in the evenings as more and more people arrived home and squeezed into diminishing slots. Yes, there she goes. Rev, rev. Sounds as if she doesn't know the length of her own car. I don't think I'll go outside and help her. I don't think that would be a good idea. The stain on the carpet was spreading. Her hands and arms still dripped, probably from when she had punched her clenched fists into his chest afterwards, to make absolutely sure. Funny, she was so squeamish about red meat, but tonight she hadn't felt sick. Still didn't, despite the fact that the whole thing had been much more spectacular than she had anticipated. Penny giggled. Movie makers didn't know the half of it. The marks might come out of the stairs and hall carpet, but there wasn't a chance of eradicating the mess upstairs. Bathroom, bedroom, she hadn't quite struck cleanly. Ha! Joke! The first time. So David had managed to get to the bedroom before shock and pain keeled him over, and she had been able to finish it all properly. The heart really is an efficient pump, isn't it? I hadn't realized it would go on for so long. The revving outside stopped at last. Footsteps now, click of elegant heels approaching the front gate. Penny giggled again, and this time had a degree of trouble making it stop. Silly woman, control yourself. It's no laughing matter. At that thought, she covered her mouth with a stained hand and snorted like a horse. Her face was smeared when she finally sobered and took the hand away, but she wasn't aware of it and wouldn't have minded in the least anyway. Come on, footsteps. I can hear you. Up the path. Hello, Carmine. Come in. I've been expecting you, and I'm all ready. A shape loomed dimly through the frosted glass panel in the door, and the bell rang just once, demurely. Bitch, two-timer, cheat, betrayer, made my husband immortal, did you? Well, he isn't immortal anymore. Maybe I'll let you see him, but I think it's better if I don't. Safer. I don't want to lose the element of surprise, after all. Penny stood up and started to smile. The hall mirror, as she passed it, reflected a demonic vision of gory red and deathly white, with eyes that burned and laughed and burned. Her hands felt as if they were burning too, but it didn't matter any more than Carmine's lateness mattered. The smile on her face was fixed now, as if nothing could ever erase it, and her right hand closed more firmly on the hilt of the scarlet knife behind her back, as with her left she reached out to open the front door. Oh my god. Oh, that was a fun story. Holy crap. First you're like, she's a bitch, but I kind of love her too. Oh, she's a crazy one. I really like that story. That was fun. Okay, rated it. It was, oh wait, I gotta do my usual. Services rendered by Louise Cooper. Yeah, I think Prince of Flowers, services rendered, and then the just his type is my ranking, top to bottom. I had fun. Thank you for being here, and for anyone else, thank you if you made it this far. I really appreciate it. Welcome to the book club. You can't leave, and you don't get to ask to join. Once you're here, you're in it. That's how it is, and I'm not sorry. I like to do these every Sunday. This is the longest one so far. 2 hours, 2.5 hours. Damn. Usually they're like an hour or something. I do like maybe 2 stories. But yeah, every Sunday, try to do it around 6. Hopefully there's no problem with streaming. Thank you for being here, and for anybody who, again, yeah. Okay. Bye-bye, guys.